The story of Peter the Hermit stands at the edge of history and legend, where truth and tradition blend into a powerful narrative. While later accounts give him a central role in inspiring the First Crusade, earlier and more reliable sources remained cautious. They do not clearly confirm that he persuaded Pope Urban II, or that he even attended the famous council where the crusade was proclaimed. Instead, he appears as a passionate preacher whose influence may have been limited to certain regions of northern France. Yet despite these uncertainties, the traditional story of his journey and mission remained compelling, shaping how generations understood the origins of the crusading movement. According to that widely told account, Peter was born near Amiens and set out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in the early 1090s. What he encountered there left a deep impression on him. The holy sites were described as neglected and mistreated, and Christian pilgrims faced hardship and danger. Local Christians living under foreign rule were said to suffer under heavy burdens, unable to freely practice their faith. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, when approached, expressed sorrow and helplessness. He feared that conditions might grow even worse unless help arrived from the West. In this moment, Peter is said to have made a promise to carry this message across Europe and awaken its rulers to the plight of the Holy Land. The story continues with a dramatic turning point. After speaking with the Patriarch, Peter spent the night in prayer at the tomb of Christ. Exhausted from his vigil, he eventually fell asleep. In his dream, Christ appeared to him and gave him a clear command: return to the West and fulfill the mission he had accepted. But first, he was instructed to obtain written proof of his purpose. At dawn, Peter hurried back to the Patriarch, who provided him with letters to support his cause. With these in hand, Peter left Jerusalem, travelled to the coast, and set sail for Italy, determined to bring his message before the Pope. When Peter reached Pope Urban II, the reception was said to be favourable. The Pope listened carefully and showed immediate interest in the situation described. Over the following months, a series of church gatherings took place in Italy, where the idea of a great expedition began to take shape. Eventually, the focus shifted northward across the Alps, where a larger and more decisive assembly would be held. That meeting took place in the French town of Claremont in November 1095, drawing nobles, clergy, and common people from across the region. Pope Urban II himself was a figure shaped by both religious devotion and political struggle. Born in northern France and trained in the influential monastic tradition of Cluny, he rose through the ranks of the Church during a time of conflict between the papacy and secular rulers. His leadership was tested by tensions within Europe, including disputes involving kings and nobles, as well as broader concerns about the stability of Christendom. At the same time, appeals for help had arrived from the Byzantine Empire, which faced growing pressure from Turkish forces in the east. These requests added urgency to the idea of a united response. At the Council of Claremont, Urban addressed a vast gathering. The official records of the meeting briefly mention a call for those who journeyed to Jerusalem with sincere intent to receive spiritual reward. However, other accounts preserve more detailed versions of the speech that followed. In these retellings, the Pope spoke directly to the people in a language they understood, rather than in formal Latin. His message combined religious devotion with emotional appeal, describing the suffering of Christians in the East and the desecration of sacred places. He called upon the warriors present to turn away from their internal conflicts and direct their strength toward a higher purpose. Instead of fighting one another, they were urged to defend their faith and protect fellow believers. The journey ahead was presented not only as a physical challenge but as a spiritual path, where sacrifice and hardship would lead to eternal reward. The lands of the East were described as rich yet troubled, and those who took part in the expedition were promised both honour and salvation. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. As the Pope's words came to an end, the crowd responded with a unified cry declaring that this was the will of God. The moment carried a sense of shared conviction, as if the decision had been made collectively, rather than imposed from above. The Pope, raising his voice once more, affirmed this response and encouraged them to carry that cry as their guiding call in the campaign ahead. What followed was a surge of commitment. People came forward to take a solemn vow, symbolized by the wearing of a cross. Each participant accepted specific responsibilities. Those with wealth were expected to support the effort, while others prepared to join the journey themselves. At the same time, certain restrictions were emphasized. The elderly and those unable to endure the hardships were advised to remain behind. Clergy required permission to participate, and families were to be protected during the absence of those who departed. The movement quickly gained momentum. News spread across regions, drawing in nobles and commoners alike. When it was announced that powerful leaders had pledged their support, enthusiasm grew even stronger. The expedition was no longer just an idea, but a collective undertaking, shaped by faith, ambition, and a sense of shared purpose. After the great gathering at Claremont, the message did not remain confined to a single place. Bishops and priests returned to their regions and began spreading the call with urgency and conviction. From churches to marketplaces, their voices carried the same powerful message. As they spoke, the people responded with a unified cry, echoing the words first heard at Claremont, declaring that this mission was the will of God. The phrase spread rapidly, repeated by nobles, peasants, and clergy alike, becoming a symbol of shared purpose and belief. In the weeks that followed, many began to search for signs that this movement had been foretold. The sky itself seemed to offer confirmation. One night, a respected bishop known for his knowledge of the stars observed an unusual display. The heavens were filled with falling lights, streaking across the darkness. To him, this was not a random event, but a sign of great change. He interpreted it as a symbol of people leaving their homelands, journeying far from where they were born, many never to return. Soon after, an eclipse darkened the moon, turning it deep shades of red and black, which many took as another omen of upheaval and transformation. Stories spread quickly, growing more dramatic with each retelling. It was said that news of the council had reached distant lands almost instantly, bringing hope to Christians and fear to their rivals, as if the sound of a divine call had echoed across the world. At the time of the council, only a few major nobles had committed themselves to the expedition. But as the message spread, enthusiasm grew across Western Europe. Those who had attended returned home, carrying not only news but a sense of urgency. In towns and along roads, conversations turned almost entirely to the journey ahead. The call to Jerusalem dominated every discussion. Those who had chosen to join felt pride in their decision, while those who hesitated often felt shame, as if they were failing in a moment of great importance. This surge of enthusiasm came during a period of hardship. A poor harvest had left many struggling to survive. Food was scarce, and even those with means felt the strain. The wealthy, who had stored supplies in better years, found themselves in a position of advantage, able to profit from rising prices. Yet this situation changed rapidly after the call to arms spread. Instead of hoarding, many people began selling their possessions. Markets that had once suffered from shortage were suddenly filled with goods. Prices fell sharply, and items that had been rare became easy to obtain. What had seemed like a season of scarcity turned into a moment of unexpected abundance, driven by the desire of so many to prepare for departure. Not everyone was motivated by faith alone. Some saw an opportunity to profit from the movement, taking advantage of the enthusiasm around them. Yet even among those who initially mocked the idea, attitudes could change quickly. A man might laugh at his neighbour's decision one day, only to follow the same path the next, selling everything he owned for a fraction of its value in order to join the journey. The movement gained particular strength in northeastern France and along the Rhine. Although the main armies would take time to organise, many people refused to wait. The energy of the moment pushed them forward, and certain figures emerged who gave direction to this restless enthusiasm. Among them, Peter the Hermit became one of the most influential voices. During the winter months, he travelled from place to place, calling on people to take action. Crowds gathered wherever he went, drawn by his intensity and conviction. Descriptions of him emphasize his modest appearance, yet his presence had a powerful effect. He moved through towns surrounded by followers, inspiring devotion wherever he spoke. His influence was so strong that entire communities seemed to empty as people chose to follow him. While such descriptions may exaggerate the scale, they reflect the remarkable impact of his preaching. As spring approached in 1096, groups of pilgrims began to set out. However, the excitement of the time also had darker consequences. In some places, the movement turned into violence. Misguided beliefs led certain groups to attack others, seeing such actions as part of their mission. Communities were destroyed, and innocent lives were lost. These events revealed how quickly enthusiasm could shift into chaos when driven by fear and misunderstanding. Around Easter, a large group of followers gathered in Cologne under Peter's influence. While he hoped to continue preaching and organize the movement more carefully, many refused to delay. They set out under the leadership of lesser-known figures, beginning a journey that would take them through unfamiliar lands. Passing through Hungary, they were initially welcomed and allowed to continue without trouble. But tensions soon arose. Small incidents escalated into conflict, and discipline broke down among the travellers. As a result, local forces retaliated, scattering the group and causing significant losses. Those who survived struggled through forests and difficult terrain before reaching safer ground. Eventually, they made their way to Constantinople, where they waited for others to arrive. Meanwhile, Peter himself gathered another group and followed a similar route. His followers moved through Central Europe, sometimes travelling on foot and sometimes using rivers for transport. They reached the borders of Hungary and continued with permission. But again, conflict emerged, when signs of earlier violence provoked anger among the group. This led to attacks on towns, further escalating tensions. Despite moments of order, the journey was marked by repeated clashes. Supplies were lost, and many became separated from the main group. Yet those who remained continued forward, eventually reaching Constantinople. There, they encountered the Byzantine emperor, who advised them to wait for the larger, better organized armies that were still to come. But discipline remained a problem. Acts of disorder within the city created further tension, and the emperor decided to move them quickly across to Asia. Once across the strait, the group settled near the coast, where they received provisions and rest. However, not all remained together. Some smaller bands broke away, seeking their own path toward their goal. One such group occupied an abandoned fortress, but soon found themselves surrounded by enemy forces. Without access to clean water, their situation became desperate. They resorted to extreme measures to survive. But after days of suffering, they were defeated. Meanwhile, the main group faced its own dangers. Without strong leadership, they were vulnerable. Enemy forces launched a sudden attack, catching them unprepared. Many were killed, including key figures among them. A portion of the survivors managed to take refuge in a nearby stronghold, holding out until help finally arrived. Their rescue marked the end of one of the earliest and most chaotic phases of the movement. Other groups that set out independently met similar fates. Poor discipline, lack of preparation, and conflicts with local populations led to repeated disasters. Entire groups were destroyed, often after provoking the very people they depended on for safe passage. In some cases, survivors fled back toward their homelands, while others were lost entirely. When the First Crusade moved from preaching into action, none of the reigning monarchs of Western Europe personally took the field. No king led the expedition, and even the greatest princes delayed their departure until the middle of 1096. The months after Claremont were spent preparing for a journey on a scale few had ever imagined. Passage had to be negotiated across foreign lands. Food had to be secured for thousands of travellers, and routes had to be chosen with care. Although sea travel might seem the faster option, most preferred the long road east. The Mediterranean inspired fear, and the overland route through Central Europe and the Balkans felt more familiar, following paths used by earlier pilgrims. Since the crusading movement had drawn in enormous numbers, a single marching column was impossible. Instead, the expedition advanced in several separate armies, each with its own leaders, timetable, and route. The first major contingent set out in the summer of 1096, and the last did not fully join the others until the following year, when the campaign in Asia Minor was already underway. One of the earliest great leaders to march east was Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine. He was a man in his mid-30s, shaped by the politics and warfare of the empire long before the Crusade gave him a larger reputation. His family had been deeply involved in the turbulent struggles of the age. He had inherited military experience, noble ambition, and a tradition of forceful action. In his youth, he had fought in imperial conflicts and had spent years navigating the shifting loyalties of princes, bishops, and emperors. Later, generations would remember him as a model of sacred knighthood. But before the Crusade, his image was more mixed, that of a formidable aristocrat whose piety had not yet eclipsed his political and military instincts. When Godfrey reached the Hungarian frontier, he encountered the consequences of the earlier, chaotic movements of poorly disciplined pilgrims. King Koloman of Hungary, angered by the damage already done in his lands, refused immediate passage. Only after careful negotiation was an agreement reached. To prove his good faith, Godfrey allowed close members of his own family to remain as hostages, while terms were settled. Once this guarantee was accepted, his army crossed peacefully, buying supplies in proper fashion and avoiding the kind of disorder that had ruined earlier expeditions. For a time, this disciplined progress seemed to promise a very different kind of crusade from the uncontrolled marches that had come before. After crossing into Byzantine territory, Godfrey was met by envoys of Emperor Alexios, who promised provisions as long as the Crusaders avoided plunder. The emperor largely kept that promise, and markets were opened for the army. But tension soon appeared beneath the surface of this apparent cooperation. News spread that Hugh of Vermandois had been detained in Constantinople, and Godfrey saw this as an insult. At first he held back, but when appeals for Hugh's release failed, he authorised devastation in the surrounding countryside. Only after further negotiation did he suspend these actions and continue toward the imperial capital. When he camped outside Constantinople, suspicion deepened on both sides. Godfrey declined invitations to enter the city and even refused gifts, fearing deception. Alexios answered with pressure of his own, briefly restricting the food supply. Before long, minor acts of plundering by the Crusaders and fresh bargaining between the two camps forced yet another compromise. The emperor wanted the Western army kept at a distance from the heart of his capital. He persuaded Godfrey to move into a more suitable area along the Bosphorus, where the Byzantine elite maintained palaces and estates. Even there, mistrust remained strong. Godfrey still resisted personal attendance at court, and matters became so strained that armed confrontation nearly broke out. Eventually, a settlement was reached, hostages were exchanged, and Godfrey finally met the emperor in the imperial palace. Not long afterward, and at Alexios's urging, he crossed into Asia Minor with his forces, becoming the first of the major leaders to move the crusade onto Asian soil. Another of the great crusading commanders was Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince whose name already carried weight in the eastern Mediterranean. He had spent years in war and had fought against Byzantium before the crusade ever began. According to later accounts, he first committed himself while engaged in a military campaign in southern Italy. Reports arrived that countless warriors from the west were heading east under the sign of the cross. Bohemond immediately grasped both the scale and the opportunity of the movement. He joined the cause, and with him came his young kinsman Tancred, whose fame would later grow greatly in the wars of the East. Their decision drew many followers, especially among Norman knights already accustomed to long campaigns and ambitious ventures. Bohemond crossed the Adriatic and advanced through the Balkans in a comparatively orderly fashion. His army appears to have been well supplied, and his leadership kept discipline firmer than in many other contingents. When he approached Constantinople, Alexios invited him ahead to the capital before the bulk of his men arrived. The emperor knew well the danger and the usefulness of a man like Bohemond. The Norman had talent, ambition, and a history of hostility toward Byzantium. Instead of confronting him directly, Alexios used diplomacy. By promises and calculated generosity, he drew Bohemond into an agreement and secured from him an oath of loyalty. This oath would become one of the defining issues of the crusade because it revealed that the emperor did not intend to be a passive host. He wanted control, recognition, and eventually the return of lands the empire had lost. The Third Great Army marched under Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, one of the most powerful lords in southern France. Raymond was older than most of the other leaders and brought with him not only military strength but also immense prestige. His following included many nobles from the south and, most importantly, Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate whose presence gave the army a special religious authority. Raymond's march was one of the harshest. His men crossed difficult country along the Dalmatian coast in winter, struggling through mountains, cold, hunger, fog, and attacks from hostile local groups. The journey was brutal, and the army endured constant pressure from raids, shortages, and the strain of moving such large numbers across unforgiving terrain. Raymond attempted to protect his weaker followers and keep his column together, but his route was marked by violence and reprisal. He negotiated where he could, punished when he thought it necessary, and pushed onward through a landscape where alliances were fragile and trust almost absent. By the time he reached Byzantine territory, hopes of a warm welcome had faded. His army encountered harassment and betrayal, and many of his men concluded that imperial professions of friendship masked something far more calculating. When Raymond himself arrived in Constantinople, the central dispute emerged once again. Unlike several other leaders, he resisted giving full homage to Alexios. He was willing to promise not to harm the emperor and not to tolerate attacks on him. But he refused language that would make him the emperor's vassal in the ordinary feudal sense. This half-settlement preserved a working relationship, though not an easy one. Even so, Raymond earned a certain respect at court. He was seen as proud, but also as sincere and unusually steadfast. The last of the major Western contingents to depart was led by Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, the eldest son of William the Conqueror. With him travelled Stephen of Blois, Robert of Flanders, and other important nobles from northern France and neighbouring lands. their army chose the Italian route. On the way south, they received encouragement from the Pope before continuing to the Adriatic coast. Winter, however, slowed their passage. Storms made crossing dangerous, and much of the army had to wait in southern Italy and Calabria until conditions improved. While great lords could rely on hospitality and resources, ordinary pilgrims suffered badly in the delay. Some, unable to support themselves, abandoned the expedition and returned home in humiliation. Others remained, hoping that endurance would yet bring them honour and salvation. When spring finally came, the crossing resumed. Even then, signs of danger were impossible to ignore. At one point, a ship carrying hundreds of pilgrims sank, and the loss shook morale. But as often happened during the Crusade, tragedy was quickly interpreted through the language of faith. Stories circulated that some of the dead bore miraculous signs on their bodies, and what might have spread despair was turned instead into a hopeful omen. Those whose courage held sailed on, crossed into the Balkans and continued overland to Constantinople. There, they encountered the same awe and unease that had marked the arrival of earlier armies. The city seemed impossibly vast, wealthy, and magnificent to many Western observers. Yet admiration did not erase suspicion, and the emperor remained cautious about allowing large bodies of armed foreigners too close to the urban centre. As the crusading armies arrived one after another, over many months, the Byzantines had every reason to feel alarm. These were not small pilgrim groups, but armed populations filled with different languages, customs, tempers, and ambitions. Western chroniclers often accused Alexios of deception, and there is evidence that his dealings could indeed be sharp and self-serving. But from the imperial perspective, the problem was real and immediate. Feeding these armies, moving them onward, and preventing disorder near the capital demanded constant management. In many places, markets did provide ample supplies. Several armies were able to purchase food in abundance, and the imperial administration clearly worked to sustain them. Yet no medieval system could operate without friction on this scale. Delays, local fear, shortages, and misunderstandings repeatedly led to conflict. The deeper problem was distrust. The Crusaders suspected that Alexios was trying to control them for his own ends. Alexios suspected that at least some of their leaders were using the expedition to pursue their own ambitions in former imperial lands. These fears were not imaginary. Bohemond, in particular, had every reason to be viewed with caution. Byzantine observers later argued that alongside sincere pilgrims, there were calculating men who looked not only toward Jerusalem, but also toward power, territory, and the riches of the eastern Mediterranean. Alexios, therefore, pursued a clear policy. Before granting easy passage into Asia, he required the leaders to swear that lands formerly held by the empire would be returned to imperial authority, if recovered. Whatever Western princes might conquer beyond that could perhaps be granted to them under imperial overlordship. But the emperor meant to claim the legal advantage first. This demand became a test of the relationship between the Crusade and Byzantium. Godfrey eventually accepted. Bohemond did as well, though many suspected calculation behind his compliance. Raymond yielded only in a limited form. Tancred tried to evade the matter altogether and slipped across into Asia without first submitting himself. Later, he too was forced into some form of accommodation, though not without resentment. These disputes mattered because they planted the first lasting seeds of division. Long before the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, tension over loyalty, possession, and political authority had already begun to shape the expedition's future. Once the armies had assembled in Asia Minor, their first major objective was Nicaea, a vital city held by the Seljuk Turks. The Crusaders reached it in early May 1097 and began the siege. Their opening attacks failed, and the defenders held firm while awaiting relief. Soon, word arrived that Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk ruler, was advancing with an army to break the siege. This raised the stakes immediately. The Crusaders, still learning to fight together despite their divided leadership, faced the possibility of being trapped between the city and a field army moving to rescue it. The battle that followed brought them their first major victory against the Turks. As Seljuk forces descended toward the city, reinforcements from other crusading contingents reached the field at a critical moment. The fighting was intense, but by the end of the day, the Turks had been beaten back. The victory transformed morale. Heads of fallen enemies were displayed before the walls to intimidate the defenders. A grim message that relief had failed and that the balance had turned. Afterward, the siege tightened. More Crusader forces arrived, and the city was increasingly enclosed, though one side remained open to supply because of the nearby lake. That final weakness was closed only through imperial help. Alexios arranged for boats to be transported overland and launched onto the lake, cutting off the city's last easy access. With that, Nicaea's position became hopeless. The Crusaders expected that once the city fell, they would be rewarded with the plunder that medieval warfare usually promised. But Alexios moved first. The defenders surrendered to the emperor's representatives rather than to the Western armies, and imperial banners appeared on the walls before the Crusaders could storm the city. For many among the rank and file, this felt like betrayal. Their labour, danger, and expectation of reward had been denied at the decisive moment. The emperor distributed money and gifts, but resentment remained. Among the common soldiers, bitterness spread quickly. They believed that the best rewards had been withheld and that imperial gratitude was a poor substitute for the wealth they had expected to seize. Even so, the campaign continued. At the end of June, the Crusaders marched away from Nicaea and advanced deeper into Anatolia, on the road toward Antioch. During this movement, the army divided into two large columns, whether by intention or by circumstance. One marched under leaders including Raymond, Adhemar, Godfrey, and Robert of Flanders. The other included Bohemond, Tancred, Hugh of Vermandois, and Robert of Normandy. This division exposed them to danger, and within days it became clear how vulnerable separated forces could be in open country. Bohemond's column was the first to face the storm. Near Dorileam, Turkish forces appeared in great numbers on the surrounding heights. The Crusaders halted and rapidly prepared for battle, drawing the baggage together and sending urgent calls for the second column to come up. The knights dismounted in places to strengthen the defensive line, while infantry and camp followers tried to preserve some order amid confusion. The Turks attacked with speed and pressure, surrounding the Crusaders and wearing them down with missiles. It was a desperate contest, one of those moments when an army feels itself close to destruction but continues to fight because retreat would be worse. Accounts of the battle remembered not only the mounted warriors, but also the support roles that kept the defence alive. Camp followers carried water to men fighting in the heat and dust. Leaders moved through the lines trying to hold morale together. For a time the Crusaders seemed near collapse. Then the second column arrived. Fresh forces entered the battle, the pressure shifted, and the Turkish army lost its advantage. What had looked like impending defeat became a sudden and dramatic victory. The Crusaders drove the enemy from the field and captured part of their camp and supplies. The Battle of Dorileum became one of the defining early moments of the campaign. It proved that the Crusaders, despite their divisions and difficulties, could stand against the mobile armies of the Turks when they held together long enough for support to arrive. It also fed a growing sense among many participants that the expedition moved under divine favour. stories soon spread that heavenly warriors had appeared on the battlefield, mounted in shining armour and charging beside the Christian host. Whether believed literally or repeated as pious interpretation, such tales reveal how contemporaries understood victory. Military success was rarely seen as strategy alone. It was woven into a larger framework of signs, providence, and holy purpose. After the victory at Dorileam, the crusading armies pushed deeper into the interior of Asia Minor, and the triumph they had just celebrated gave way almost immediately to exhaustion, thirst, and fear. The road ahead crossed harsh uplands and barren stretches where water was scarce, settlements were few, and the summer heat became an enemy as dangerous as any army. The march through the high country left a deep mark on those who survived it. Under the brutal sun of July, men collapsed from thirst, horses dropped where they stood, and the weak fell behind with little hope of recovery. Women travelling with the host suffered terribly, and some went into labour along the roadside before their time, bringing children into a landscape that offered almost no chance of survival. The suffering became so extreme that men moved forward with mouths open, as if even the faintest moving air might ease the burning in their throats. Hunting birds and dogs carried by noblemen died in the hands of their keepers. When at last a stream was found, discipline gave way to desperation. Men and animals rushed to it in a frenzy, and some drank so wildly that the water which promised life instead brought death. At length the army descended from the most unforgiving ground into more fertile country near Iconium, where the contrast must have seemed almost miraculous. There, among greener valleys and more settled lands, local inhabitants showed the Crusaders practical ways to endure the climate, including how to carry and preserve water in animal skins. Yet even in this moment of relief, unity within the expedition began to weaken. At Heraclea, now on the edge of the road towards Cilicia, Tancred and Baldwin separated from the main host and moved south through the narrow pass, later remembered as the Gates of Judas. Their purpose was no longer simply to continue with the larger army towards Syria. Both men were now looking for lands, allies, and opportunities of their own. They were not alone in this instinct. Other major leaders also drifted from the direct line of march for reasons that remain uncertain, some turning northward toward Armenian country before eventually rejoining the wider movement. Even before Antioch came into view, the Crusade had begun to produce something beyond pilgrimage and holy war. It had begun to generate conquest. By the time the main army reached Antioch in October 1097, this change was already visible. But before turning to the Great Siege, events in Cilicia and Armenia revealed the first real fruits of Frankish expansion in the east. When Tancred entered the Cilician plain and pitched his camp before Tarsus, he found a city whose population was largely Christian, but whose military control remained in Turkish hands. This was a pattern the Crusaders would encounter again and again in the east. Towns whose inhabitants might prefer new rulers, if those rulers offered security. The citizens of Tarsus were ready to place themselves under Western protection, and in the absence of Bohemond, Tancred eagerly took on that role. The Turkish garrison seemed close to surrender. Then Baldwin appeared with his own force on the nearby heights, and confusion followed. The Turks, mistaking the newcomers for allies, withdrew from their earlier understanding. Baldwin then joined the siege, but what followed was not cooperation. He used his presence and reputation to persuade the city to shift its allegiance from Tancred to himself. Tancred lacked the strength to challenge him openly and withdrew in anger, receiving a more welcoming reception elsewhere. The rivalry did not end there. Once Tarsus had fallen and Baldwin had left a garrison behind, he set out eastward again. Tancred, now established at another town, watched as his rival once more arrived to claim a place already nearly within Norman reach. This time, tempers broke. The Norman knights attacked Baldwin's men, and fighting erupted between fellow Crusaders. The clash ended without decisive result, and by the following day, both sides recognized the shame of what they had done. They had taken vows for a sacred enterprise, yet already they were spilling one another's blood over possession and advantage. Peace was restored, but the meaning of that peace was limited. Baldwin went on in search of greater opportunity in Armenia, while Tancred continued toward Antioch along the coast. From this point onward, Baldwin's path would lead not merely to fame, but to the creation of the first permanent Crusader principality. Among the cities of Upper Mesopotamia, Adessa held a special place in Christian memory and Eastern tradition. It was one of the ancient centers of Syrian Christianity, a city wrapped in old legends, apostolic associations, and a long sacred history. Yet by the late 11th century, it stood in a fragile political landscape. Its ruler, Thoros, was an Armenian prince governing a threatened frontier city. Though he acknowledged Byzantine authority in name, real power in the region was unstable and fragmented. Turkish forces pressed from all sides. Armenian lands had been overrun in many areas, and populations were moving, adapting, and surviving amid the collapse of older structures. In such conditions, a Frankish noble with armed followers could appear not only as an intruder, but also as a possible saviour. Disorder created opportunity, and the Crusaders were quick to recognise it. Baldwin was encouraged toward Adessa by an Armenian advisor who had joined the expedition earlier, and understood the political openings in the region. News of Baldwin's reputation reached Thoros, who soon invited him to come east and assist against Turkish enemies beyond the Euphrates. Baldwin accepted immediately. With only a relatively small mounted force, he crossed the river and entered Adessa in triumph, welcomed with ceremony and expectation. At first, the arrangement seemed straightforward. Thoros had sought military support, and Baldwin seemed willing to provide it. But once inside the city, new tensions emerged. Baldwin became popular, perhaps more popular than Thoros intended. The Armenian ruler grew suspicious, and then refused to fulfill the payments he had promised. The local political elite, apparently organised in a kind of aristocratic council, pressed Thoros to keep his word. They wanted Baldwin retained in the city as a valuable military asset, and perhaps, by then, some among them already imagined a transfer of power. Under pressure, Thoros tried to secure Baldwin's loyalty through adoption. In a striking local ritual, he and his wife embraced Baldwin beneath their garments, pressing him to their bare chests, as a symbolic act of kinship and succession. The ceremony was meant to bind the Frankish count to the ruling house and make him son as well as ally. But such gestures could not resolve the deeper reality. Baldwin had now seen how weak Thoros was and how divided the city had become. Soon he led an unsuccessful expedition against a nearby Turkish ruler, and when he returned, sentiment in Adessa had shifted further in his favour. A conspiracy was taking shape. In the days before Easter, 1098, violence broke out. Thoros and his supporters were attacked, and the ruler was shut up in his own stronghold. Baldwin appears to have been involved, though perhaps not openly at every stage. He is said to have offered Thoros safe conduct in exchange for surrendering his treasure and leaving the city. Whether he intended to protect him or merely to remove him is impossible to know. In any case, events quickly escaped any promise. Thoros tried to flee by lowering himself from a window with a rope, was discovered, and was killed. His body, pierced with arrows, was cast down before the people. With that, Baldwin became Lord of Adessa. It was the first real territorial gain secured by a major Crusader leader in the east, but it was far from secure. Turkish powers remained near, his own following was small, and he had already seen how unstable Armenian alliances could be. Even so, he governed with confidence and acted as if his position were fully established. Nearby rulers tested him with tribute offers and negotiation, and he answered as a prince, not as a wandering pilgrim. He secured another town to the south, placing one of his followers in charge, and then worked to strengthen his rule by marriage. His first wife had died earlier in the campaign, and now he married into an important Armenian family, taking a bride whose connections helped root him more firmly among the local elites. This alliance gave his rule a degree of legitimacy among Armenian subjects and strengthened his hand against Turkish enemies. Yet legitimacy did not bring safety. Edessa remained exposed, isolated, and dependent on careful management, negotiation, and force. Baldwin could not provide much direct help to the main crusading army at Antioch, and at one point he himself faced siege by a major Muslim commander moving westward. Still, he did what he could, sending provisions to his brother Godfrey and offering support where possible. Armenian lands also became a zone of side campaigns and wandering adventures for crusaders, frustrated by the long delay before Antioch. This traffic, however, put immense strain on Edessa's resources. Feeding allies, paying troops, and holding a mixed population together required money, and Baldwin resorted to harsh exactions. These measures led to unrest and rebellion. Though he suppressed opposition, his actions alienated many who had first welcomed him. From its beginning, then, the county of Adessa was both an achievement and a burden, a bold Frankish foothold won through calculation, opportunism, and violence, yet always surrounded by danger. While Baldwin established himself in the northeast, the main crusading army had settled before Antioch, one of the great cities of the Near East. Antioch was no ordinary objective. Founded in the Hellenistic age and once among the foremost cities of the Roman world, it had long been a centre of commerce, learning, and Christian life. It had served as the seat of one of the major patriarchates and carried immense prestige in both Eastern and Western imagination. Its history was layered with imperial grandeur, theological memory, and strategic importance. Massive walls, strengthened and restored over centuries, still defended a vast enclosed area. Even after earthquakes, invasions, and the erosion of time, Antioch remained an intimidating fortress city. Its setting made it even harder to attack. The Orontes flowed beside it, and behind it rose broken heights cut by ravines and crowned with fortifications. The citadel dominated the heights, while the Arles ran over difficult ground that made any full encirclement nearly impossible. Gates on several sides controlled access to bridge, plain, and hill, and the city's size meant that a besieging force would need enormous numbers to seal it completely. When the Crusaders arrived in October 1097, they faced this reality at once. However large their army may have been in rumour, it was not large enough to invest the entire circuit effectively. They therefore concentrated their camps along the most vulnerable sections, especially on the northern and northeastern sides. The leaders took up positions according to their contingents. Bohemond held one crucial point opposite the heights. Tancred camped near him. The two Roberts occupied another sector, while Raymond and Adhemar stood nearer one of the major approaches. Godfrey and the Germans guarded another important gate. It was a loose ring, dangerous because it was incomplete, but the best they could manage. For the first 2 weeks, the defenders remained cautious. No major Turkish sortie emerged, and local Christians came and went from the camp, claiming solidarity with the besiegers. Yet many of them also acted as informants for the city, gathering news and passing it inward. Before long, the defenders grew bolder. Turkish forces began making attacks from the gates, while hostile groups from nearby strongholds added further pressure. As winter approached, the Crusaders discovered that Antioch would not fall quickly. Food became scarce. The surrounding lands could not safely be foraged without strong escort, and the open country itself was increasingly dangerous. A large expedition sent out under Bohemond and Robert of Flanders returned with little success, and while many fighters were absent, the defenders struck the camp hard, killing knights and infantry and exposing just how vulnerable the besiegers were. After that setback, the local Armenians and Syrians, who had once traded with the Crusaders, largely withdrew their help and turned instead toward the safer side, inside the walls. As the year turned and 1098 began, conditions worsened dramatically. Horses lacked fodder, prices rose beyond reason. Even a single day's food became difficult to purchase. Hardship bred fear, and fear quickly spread through the camp. Strange lights in the sky, tremors of the earth, and the bleakness of winter seemed to many like signs that heaven itself had turned against the army. Leaders fell sick. Morale faltered. Some began to speak openly of abandoning the siege. Bohemond himself, never a man to hide hard realities, warned that he could not simply watch his followers die in misery. At this critical moment, word arrived that a large Muslim relief force was approaching from the east. Far from causing total collapse, the threat forced decision. Bohemond proposed that half the army march out to meet the danger while the other half remained to watch Antioch. It was a dangerous gamble, but the Crusaders accepted it. The relief army was encountered in February 1098. Bohemond advanced by night, and at dawn found the enemy near a river. The initial phase of the fighting went badly for the Crusaders. The battle seemed at risk of turning into another disaster in the midst of famine and despair. But reserves under Bohemond's direct command reversed the course of events. The Muslim force was beaten, its camp was plundered, and Bohemond returned to Antioch with grim trophies that announced victory to the camp and warning to the city. This success gave the besiegers new confidence. They now set about improving their position more permanently by constructing fortifications of their own. One on the height above Bohemond's camp, and another near the bridge across the Orontes. These works were intended to limit sorties from the city and tighten pressure where direct assault had failed. During one phase of this construction, the Turkish commander launched another attack, sending troops across the bridge and cutting them off from retreat. The fighting that followed was sharp and close. A relatively small body of Crusaders made a desperate charge and forced the attackers back toward the river. As Bohemond returned to the field, the congestion on the bridge and causeway turned retreat into catastrophe for many defenders. Some were cut down outright, others fell into the river and drowned, and the result was celebrated in the Crusader camp as a major success. The dead were later treated with extreme brutality. Their burial places were violated and their heads taken as proof of the victory. Such actions were part of the harsh language of siege warfare, but they also revealed how deeply rage and religious hostility had hardened on both sides during the long blockade. Behind the scenes, Bohemond had been playing a longer game. Even while the siege dragged on, he appears to have cultivated contacts within Antioch. At the same time, he had extracted from most of the leading Crusader princes a promise that if he could secure the city, it would become his. Raymond of Toulouse resisted such arrangements, but Bohemond pressed the matter relentlessly. Eventually, after making secret contact with an officer inside the city named Firouz, he convinced the others to agree that whoever actually took Antioch should rule it. Once that principle had been conceded, Bohemond revealed that he had a way in. A plan was set. On the day before the attempt, part of the Christian army went out foraging to make the city think nothing unusual was at hand. Then, during the night, a chosen group gathered below the wall, near the gate of St. George, and waited for the pre-arranged signal. Hours passed in tension while the city watch moved along the walls with lamps in hand. Only when that danger had passed did the signal finally come. A ladder had been made ready. A small advance party climbed and seized the towers under Firuz's control. Once Bohemond knew that those points were secure, he sent the rest forward. In their excitement, too many men crowded the ladder, which broke beneath them, leaving the first group isolated on the walls in darkness and uncertainty. It was a moment when the whole operation might have failed. Instead, the men already inside found their way to a gate, forced it open, and admitted their comrades. As morning light spread, Crusaders in the camps on the far side of the city saw Bohemond's banner flying from the heights. They surged forward, other gates were opened or broken, and Antioch fell. The capture of the city brought chaos rather than rest. There was slaughter, looting, and confusion. Some celebrated wildly, abandoning discipline almost as soon as victory was secured. Yet the triumph was incomplete almost from the first hour. The citadel still held out, and more dangerously, a far larger threat was already approaching. Within days, the army of Kerboga appeared before Antioch. The Crusaders who had just taken the city found themselves trapped inside it. The besiegers had become the besieged. Kerboga's forces pressed in from the south and quickly drove the Crusaders back within the walls. They even secured the citadel, turning Antioch into a trap with danger above and around. Fighting became constant. Each day brought struggle in the streets and near the gates. Each night men slept among the bodies of the dead, if they slept at all. Hope began to drain away. Fear turned into panic for some, and escape became an obsession. Under cover of darkness, individuals and groups lowered themselves from the walls by rope and fled. The shame of desertion spread through the camp like infection. Important nobles were among those who ran, and their flight shocked the entire army. Men who had once marched east as magnates and champions were now branded cowards, remembered with contempt and mocked as rope climbers and deserters. The most damaging departure was that of Stephen of Blois, one of the greatest lords in the expedition. He had already withdrawn on grounds of illness before Antioch fully fell, and his leaving would have consequences far beyond the city itself. At the very moment when the crusade needed steadfastness, its unity was fracturing again under hunger, fear, ambition, and exhaustion. The road from Dorileam to Antioch had revealed exactly what the First Crusade had become. Not a smooth holy procession, but a harsh, violent, improvised struggle in which devotion and self-interest constantly moved side by side. Antioch had been won, but it had not yet been secured, and the hardest trial of all was still beginning. As the situation inside Antioch became more desperate, messages were sent again and again to Stephen of Blois, urging him to return with help. At last, he gathered enough resolve to climb a height from which he could see the plain below. What he saw was overwhelming. The land around Antioch had disappeared beneath an ocean of enemy tents, and the scale of the encircling army crushed whatever courage he had managed to recover. Instead of rallying to the city's defense, he turned back in fear, convinced that destruction was certain. Moving north, he soon encountered Emperor Alexios, who was advancing with an army that might still have changed the fate of the siege. But Stephen's report of the hopeless situation gave the emperor exactly the excuse he needed. Despite protests from some crusading voices, Alexios abandoned the advance and withdrew to Constantinople. For the trapped Crusaders, this was a devastating blow. Any hope that imperial aid might soon appear faded almost at once. Inside Antioch, suffering deepened day by day. The defenders within the citadel remained dangerous, and the Crusaders inside the city had to throw up inner walls and maintain constant guard against attack from above as well as from outside. Hunger soon became the worst enemy of all. Prices rose to absurd levels. A small animal cost a fortune, and even scraps that would once have been thrown away became precious. Those with money could still buy miserable rations at ruinous cost, but the poor survived on almost anything they could chew or boil. Tough hides were softened in water and eaten. Leaves and refuse were searched for as if they were treasure. Men of high rank, once surrounded by retainers and servants, were reduced to begging for the barest necessities. Even prominent leaders struggled to keep horses fit for battle, and some would have faced the coming fight on foot had they not secured help through desperate means. For nearly a week, fighting had raged along the southern side of the city, and morale sank to its lowest point. It was at this darkest moment that a strange claim began to spread through the camp and alter the mood of the army. Early one morning, a poor provincial named Peter Bartholomew came before Count Raymond and Bishop Adhemar with an extraordinary story. He said that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a vision and revealed the location of the lance that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. According to Peter, he had been ordered to reveal this to the leaders, but fear had kept him silent. He claimed the vision had returned more than once and that he had even tried to flee from the burden of the message, only to be driven back by storms and circumstance. Now, having returned to Antioch, he declared that the army's salvation lay hidden beneath one of the city's churches. The story was met at first with hesitation and skepticism. Some dismissed it as fantasy or desperation speaking through a weak mind. Others, however, especially those who needed hope more than certainty, chose to listen. The bishop was doubtful, but Raymond was more receptive and placed Peter under watch and protection. Then another report followed. A priest named Stephen declared that he too had received a heavenly message, one that promised divine aid within a matter of days. These claims did not arise in a moment of confidence, but in a time when famine, fear, desertion, and exhaustion had pushed the crusading army close to collapse. Under such conditions, belief in a sign from heaven was not difficult to understand. Whether seen as policy, faith, or collective desperation, the search for the lance began. The promised days passed, and on the morning chosen for the search, a group entered the church believed to conceal the relic. From early morning until evening, they dug with growing frustration and no result. Men became exhausted. Doubt returned. Then Peter himself leapt into the pit, stripped for labour, barefoot, and driven by fierce conviction. He urged those around him to pray that God would reveal the lance for the comfort and victory of his people. At last, something metallic appeared in the earth. Those present seized upon it immediately. Joy spread through the church, and then through the city. The object was hailed as the Holy Lance, and its discovery transformed the emotional atmosphere of the Crusader camp. What had been a starving, trapped, broken force began to behave once again like an army chosen for victory. By this time, Kerbogar had effectively shifted from open siege to blockade, tightening his hold and waiting for hunger to finish what battle had begun. The days that followed are difficult to trace in exact detail, but they seem to have been a period of waiting, negotiation, and final preparation. The Crusaders may still have hoped for aid from the Emperor or from Western reinforcements, but nothing came. Attempts were made to negotiate with the enemy. Challenges were proposed. The idea of deciding matters through selected champions was raised, along with other offers. All were rejected. The enemy had no reason to bargain with a force that seemed already half dead. At last, the Crusaders accepted that only a direct assault could save them. On the morning of June 28th, they marched out to fight. Rain fell lightly at dawn, and to many in the army this was taken as a sign of blessing. the Crusaders advanced in several divisions. Hugh of Vermandois, Godfrey, and Robert of Normandy were among the leading commanders. Adhemar marched in one of the central bodies, and with him was carried the newly found lance, now treated as a sacred standard. Count Raymond remained behind to watch the citadel, while Tancred and other lords took their places in the advancing line. Priests and bishops accompanied the host, carrying crosses, and from the walls behind them, others blessed the departing army. The march from the city toward the enemy was difficult and exposed. The Muslim forces tried to close around them as they moved into the open ground, and the danger of encirclement was obvious from the start. Yet the Crusaders pressed on. Some of those closest to the sacred relic later claimed that they passed through the battle untouched, as if shielded by divine favour. On the other side, Kerbogha seems not to have expected a full assault. He had every reason to think the besieged were too weak to risk open combat. At first, he appears to have allowed them to come out, perhaps hoping to pull them farther from the city and destroy them in the plain. He also sent forces around in an attempt to strike their rear once the main action had begun. The Crusaders recognized the danger and improvised another formation to guard against being surrounded. It was a contest not only of courage, but of timing, position, and the ability to hold formation under pressure. As the armies closed, Turkish archers opened the fight, but weather and confusion reduced the effectiveness of their volleys. One part of the Muslim line gave way unexpectedly, and this encouraged the Crusaders to push harder. Elsewhere, the pressure remained intense. Bohemon's forces were heavily engaged, and the battle could still have broken against the Christians. But support arrived where it was needed, and the crusading line held. Then the momentum shifted. Once the enemy line began to waver, collapse spread quickly. Signals of retreat appeared, and soon the larger army was pulling back in disorder toward the hills. What should have been an easy victory for a well-supplied, besieging force had become a stunning defeat. The Crusaders could hardly believe what had happened. They had marched out hungry, exhausted, and outnumbered, yet by the end of the day they stood victorious over a far stronger host. Predictably, the battle was almost immediately surrounded by stories of miracle. Many claimed that heavenly cavalry had appeared on the mountains, riding white horses and carrying white banners. These warriors were identified as saintly protectors sent to aid the Christian host at the critical hour. Whether taken literally or understood as the language of faith under extreme strain, such visions captured the emotional truth of the moment. For the Crusaders, the victory did not feel merely military. It felt like rescue. With Kerbogha's defeat, Antioch was finally secured. Yet even this success did not immediately send the army racing south toward Jerusalem. The city that had drawn the Crusaders across continents still lay ahead. But the leaders hesitated. Some knew too well what summer campaigning in the Levant could do to an army already weakened by siege, disease, and hunger. An immediate march in the full heat of the season seemed reckless. So the advance was postponed, and the months that followed were spent less in united purpose than in local ambition. The crusade had already shown how quickly holy warfare could become territorial conquest, and now that tendency deepened. The leading lords began using the interval to secure fortresses and territories for themselves. Men were offered pay to join one banner or another, and scattered operations spread through the lands between Antioch and Adessa. Some strongholds fell quickly, others resisted. Count Raymond's followers captured certain positions, though not without setbacks. Raymond himself took one town and ordered a ruthless purge of its Muslim inhabitants. Once the conquest was complete, he looked for a bishop to establish Christian authority and reshape the place in both political and religious terms. In another area, local Muslim and Christian rulers alike sought alliances where they could, and even methods of communication unfamiliar to Western observers appeared as part of the landscape of war. Messenger pigeons, sent from under cloaks and tunics, astonished men who had never seen such practices used in this way. Godfrey, meanwhile, was drawn into the politics of the interior. A local ruler under pressure from Aleppo sought his support, and Godfrey responded by calling in Baldwin from Adessa. Together, the brothers marched to relieve the threatened place. Their arrival was enough to scatter its enemies. Godfrey then renewed his alliance there and offered a valuable helmet as a symbolic gift, linking his own lineage and honour to the agreement. Soon after, avoiding the worst of the summer heat, he withdrew into the higher Armenian lands, where Baldwin granted him control over useful frontier fortresses. These scattered episodes reveal how the Crusade was no longer simply moving toward Jerusalem. It was weaving itself into the politics, rivalries, and property struggles of northern Syria and Mesopotamia. At Antioch itself, the Crusaders suffered a major loss in August, with the death of Bishop Adhémar of Le Puy. He had been one of the most respected figures in the expedition, a churchman whose presence lent authority and unity to men otherwise divided by rank and ambition. His death was deeply felt, and soon visions attached themselves to his memory as well. Peter Bartholomew claimed that Adhémar had appeared after death, first suffering for his former doubts, and then restored to heavenly favour, returning in glory to reassure the army that he had not abandoned it. Such stories mattered because they kept alive the sense that the crusade moved under spiritual direction, even as quarrels among the princes threatened to reduce everything to rivalry and self-interest. When the chiefs gathered again in the autumn, one of the first disputes to resurface concerned Antioch itself. Bohemond's claim to the city was challenged, especially by Raymond, who objected to the transfer of the citadel, and more generally to Norman control. The other leaders hesitated. Few wanted to offend either Bohemond or Raymond. And so, the question drifted toward paralysis. The quarrel seemed serious enough to threaten any further advance south. In the end, Raymond, showing more restraint than some expected, agreed to postpone final settlement. If Bohemond would resume the march toward Jerusalem, the dispute could later be judged by the leading princes, though Raymond still insisted that imperial rights could not simply be ignored. Bohemond accepted the compromise, and for the moment the two rivals made peace, though both quietly strengthened their own positions within the city. Once this uneasy settlement had been reached, the army resumed movement. Raymond attacked the town of Ma'arat al-Numan, but failed at first to break it. When Bohemond arrived, the attack was renewed, yet still the walls held. Raymond then turned to engineering. A great wooden siege tower was built, rising above the defences and resisting repeated attempts to burn or shatter it. From its height, the defenders could be driven back by missiles, and once their positions on the wall were cleared, the attackers stormed in. The town fell in December 1098. What followed was slaughter on a scale grim, even by the standards of the age. Streets filled with corpses, and the conquerors moved through a city so clogged with the dead that riding became difficult. Victory, once again, brought not peace, but fresh bitterness. The fall of the town opened a new conflict between Raymond and Bohemond. The Norman openly mocked the revelations associated with Peter Bartholomew and refused to surrender his share of the conquered place unless Raymond gave up claims in Antioch. Raymond answered with accusations of greed and cowardice. He wanted to assign the town to one of his own churchmen as a military lordship, while Bohemond preferred delay and calculation. Another issue sharpened the conflict. Bohemond argued that the advance to Jerusalem should be postponed until spring. Christmas was near, many forces were absent, and conditions were uncertain. The wider army, however, had grown impatient. Large numbers favoured moving at once, and many looked to Raymond to lead them if the others would not. After hesitation, he agreed and set a day for the march. Bohemond, furious, returned to Antioch. Godfrey had to be summoned from Adessa, and another council of the leaders was held. Support for Raymond among the high princes was mixed, though not insignificant. Yet before any final resolution could be reached, the anger of ordinary crusaders found dramatic expression. Men too sick to march dragged themselves from their beds and began tearing down the walls of the very town their leaders were disputing over. Their message was unmistakable. They were sick of delay, sick of quarrels, and sick of seeing conquests turned into bargaining chips while Jerusalem still lay ahead. Even those too weak to do real labour tried to join in. Stones were hauled down by men scarcely fit to stand. Work stopped briefly when officers interfered, then resumed as soon as pressure eased. The destruction of the town became a kind of protest, a rough act of collective pressure on the leadership. At last, the march resumed in January 1099. Raymond and his followers moved south first. Their reputation had gone before them, and rulers along the Orontes often preferred to buy peace rather than test Christian violence in open resistance. The army passed through regions where food was more plentiful, and for a time conditions improved. Later, they chose to leave the inland road and angle toward the coast, hoping to secure supplies by sea and re-establish contact with ships near the Syrian ports. In February, Raymond sat down before the fortress of Arka, a strong position on difficult ground protected by strong walls. The siege dragged on for months, yet unlike Antioch, this camp was not starving. Nearby ports supplied the besiegers with provisions brought by Greek and Italian merchants, and the region offered opportunities for raids, foraging, and private military ventures. A rumour then spread that a massive eastern army was on its way to relieve the fortress. Raymond appealed for aid to Godfrey and Robert of Flanders, who were operating elsewhere. But when they arrived, the story proved false. They openly suspected that Raymond had spread the rumour himself to strengthen his own position. Complaints about his wealth and influence grew louder, especially from men who contrasted his resources with their own hardships. Meanwhile, the visions associated with Peter Bartholomew had not ceased, and they now became the object of sharper ridicule. Among the skeptics was Arnulf, a cleric attached to Robert of Normandy, who would later rise to great importance in Jerusalem. Peter answered ridicule with a dramatic challenge. He declared that he would pass through fire holding the Holy Lance, and that God would prove the truth or falsehood of his claims. The ordeal took place on Good Friday. A vast crowd gathered to watch. 2 long walls of burning branches were built close together to form a corridor of flame. Before the whole assembly, prayers were spoken that if Peter truly had received divine revelation, he would emerge unharmed. But if he had lied, he would be destroyed along with the lance he carried. Then Peter, dressed only in a simple tunic, entered the fire. Some later claimed to have seen signs above him, while most saw only a man attempting an impossible passage. He came out alive, greeted by cries of support, and had to be pulled away from the crush of the crowd by those around him. But he did not live long afterward. His death settled nothing. Believers insisted that he had passed through the flames and suffered later from the violence of the crowd. Skeptics argued that the fire itself had doomed him. The ordeal, instead of resolving the matter, hardened both camps in their existing convictions. Easter came and went, and Arka still had not fallen. The Crusaders were divided once more. Some wanted to wait for the emperor, who was still expected by some to appear before midsummer. Others pointed to the growing crops and the need to move on while the season favoured action. This second view won out. In May, the siege was finally abandoned, and the army resumed its southward march along the coast. By the time the Crusaders reached Ramla, the decisive strategic question returned. Should they strike at the wider power of Egypt and try to conquer the larger kingdom, or should they go straight for Jerusalem? Some argued that a greater campaign in the Nile region would make the holy city easier to take later, and others answered that an army too small to seize Jerusalem directly had no business dreaming of conquering an entire kingdom first. In the end, the simpler and more urgent course prevailed. Jerusalem would be the next goal. As the Crusaders drew closer, the tone of the march changed. Some men rushed to seize local estates and fortresses, eager for immediate gain before reaching the holy city. Others, influenced by the more austere spiritual current in the army, refused to burden themselves with worldly prize while approaching the object of their vows. Some walked barefoot as an act of devotion, lamenting the greed of their companions and imagining themselves at the threshold of sacred history. Then, in early June 1099, Jerusalem came into view. By then, the city was no longer in Turkish hands. It had passed under Egyptian control after earlier political shifts in the region. For some time, there had been diplomatic contact between the Crusaders and the Egyptian rulers. Offers had been discussed, including limited pilgrimage access, but they had satisfied no one. The Crusaders had no intention of accepting symbolic concessions when they believed the city itself had been promised to them by God and by their vows. So when they arrived, it was not to negotiate entry for a handful of pilgrims. It was to besiege and take the city outright. Their numbers were not enough to surround Jerusalem completely. Even now, after all the marching, sieges, battles and desertions, they had to distribute their forces as best they could around the walls. Robert of Normandy and Robert of Flanders took position to the north. Godfrey and Tancred operated from the west. Raymond placed his force on Mount Zion to the south. The eastern side, where the terrain dropped sharply and the defences were strongest, was left largely unwatched. After several days of preparation, the Crusaders launched an early assault in mid-June that came close to success but failed to secure a foothold. Once again, a siege that had seemed possible by sudden shock threatened to turn into a trial of endurance. Soon the same enemies reappeared: thirst, hunger, heat, and exhaustion. Water was terribly scarce. A small spring outside the city gave relief only intermittently, and whenever it flowed, men and animals rushed toward it in dangerous confusion. In the chaos, some were crushed, and the source itself became fouled by bodies. Those too weak to reach it lay nearby with swollen tongues and open mouths, unable even to beg properly for drink. The stench of dead animals and rotting flesh spread around the camp. Water could be found farther away, but reaching it meant driving livestock through dangerous ground where enemy raiders waited in ambush. Food supplies also tightened. Relief came only when Christian ships reached Jaffa. A mounted party was sent to secure the cargo and escort it inland. The men were welcomed by the sailors and spent the night in celebration, but dawn revealed how vulnerable they had been. Enemy forces had nearly surrounded them. Even so, they managed to unload and move the supplies before the ships themselves were mostly lost. The food that reached camp prevented immediate famine, but it did not restore harmony. Old rivalries returned almost as soon as the danger eased. Men argued over positions, banners, captured shrines, and who should lead or rule once the city was taken. Alongside these quarrels came a fresh wave of visions. Adhemar, now dead, was said to have appeared and instructed the army to process barefoot around the city for several days, combining prayer with renewed labour. The leaders, recognizing both the religious power and the political usefulness of such acts, endorsed a general reconciliation. From that point, effort turned to siege construction with fresh urgency. Wood was desperately scarce around Jerusalem, and without it, the necessary towers and engines could not be built. Small discoveries of usable beams were celebrated, as if they were treasure, but real supplies had to be brought from far away. Timber was cut in the hills and hauled under escort back to the camp. Robert of Flanders oversaw much of this difficult work. In time, 2 great siege towers were completed, one for Godfrey's sector in the north and one for Raymond's in the south. At the same time, the religious ritual demanded by the visions was also carried out. The entire army, so far as weakness and numbers allowed, processed slowly around the city barefoot, chanting, praying, and carrying crosses. Priests and bishops led the way in white vestments. The defenders on the walls mocked them, shouting insults and making gestures of contempt. Some even beat a crucifix in sight of the besiegers, using sacrilege itself as a weapon of insult. Yet the procession continued, winding past the key holy sites outside the walls and back again to camp. Meanwhile, the defenders strengthened their own position. Walls were repaired, towers reinforced, and every weak point prepared for assault. On July the 13th, the final attack began. Fighting continued into the next day without decisive result. Then came the critical moment. On Friday, the defenders tried to burn Godfrey's great siege tower, which had become fixed awkwardly at some distance from the wall because one of its wheels had broken. They also hung sacks stuffed with straw to cushion the blows of rams and protect the masonry. But the Crusaders answered with relentless missile fire that drove defenders back from the parapets. Flaming arrows set the hanging sacks alight. Ladders were raised. The drawbridge of the siege tower dropped into place against the wall. At last, the defences were breached. One of the first men to leap onto the battlements was a knight whose name would be remembered with honour in later crusading tradition. As more attackers followed, resistance collapsed in that sector. Panic spread among the defenders, and many fled toward the great sacred enclosure that had once been Solomon's temple. Jerusalem had been entered at last. On the southern side of Jerusalem, Raymond's assault had gone far less smoothly. His siege tower had been built with the help of Genoese sailors whose ships had been lost near Jaffa, and his men had worked hard to clear the outer defences and fill the ditch before the wall. Even after all that effort, the defenders still dominated the fight. Their machines outnumbered his, and every attempt to push forward met a storm of resistance. The day had already taken on a strange intensity in the Crusader camp. Some believed the hour had been foretold, and when progress stalled, explanations quickly turned toward the supernatural. A rumour spread that 2 Muslim women on the walls were casting spells to hold the attackers back. A stone struck them down, and for a moment the men below thought the obstacle had been removed. Yet nothing changed. By midday, the wall still stood firm, and the attack on Raymond's side seemed close to failure. The commanders were already considering whether the engines should be pulled back when everything changed in an instant. Far off, on the Mount of Olives, a lone, mounted figure appeared, raising his shield in a gesture of triumph. No one in Raymond's lines knew exactly who the rider was, but the meaning was understood at once. The city had been breached elsewhere. That single sign transformed despair into renewed fury. The Provençal troops threw themselves into the attack with fresh force, and the last resistance on their front began to collapse. Jerusalem had finally fallen. What followed was the kind of violence that so often marked the capture of a major city in medieval war. Once the walls had been forced and discipline dissolved into triumph, slaughter spread through the streets. Contemporary descriptions focus less on sequence than on shock. Bodies lay in every quarter. Streets, squares, and passages were choked with the dead. Severed limbs, broken armor, and blood-covered stones turned the city into a scene of horror. Some were cut down where they stood. Some were struck by arrows and hurled from towers. Others were tortured and burned. Horses and men moved over heaps of corpses as the victors pushed deeper into the city. The killing did not remain confined to soldiers. Panic drove many toward holy places, fortresses, or enclosed courtyards. But refugee often proved temporary. Tancred forced his way into the great sacred enclosure and stripped rich decorations from its buildings, seizing heavy golden hangings as part of the spoil. Even so, he seems to have shown more restraint than many around him. He offered protection to some of those who fled into the old temple area and sought shelter there. Yet in the atmosphere of that day, protection was fragile and incomplete. It could delay death, not always prevent it. At first, once the fury of battle began to ebb, many of the Crusaders turned toward the sacred purpose that had brought them east. They moved in tears and prayer toward the Holy Sepulchre, trying to transform conquest into pilgrimage. But the mood did not stay softened for long. By the next morning, anger and suspicion had returned. Rumours spread that Tancred had not truly spared the fugitives, but had only gathered them in one place. Whether this was believed, invented, or exaggerated, it had deadly consequences. The Crusaders armed themselves again and resumed the killing. On that second day, the violence was even more deliberate. Archers shot down those trapped at a distance. Others climbed onto roofs and platforms and cut down men and women alike. The slaughter inside the sacred enclosure became one of the most infamous scenes of the entire conquest. Almost every group among the attackers seems to have been carried along by the same brutal momentum. Raymond stands out as one of the few who showed a more practical and restrained mercy. Those who had taken refuge in the Tower of David were offered their lives if they surrendered, and once they submitted, he allowed them to depart safely toward Ascalon. It was a rare act of clemency in a city where vengeance, zeal, fear, and greed had fused into mass killing. The dead soon became a problem as well as a symbol. The city was filled with rotting bodies, and the danger of disease was obvious. One of the first practical tasks after the conquest was to clear the streets. Surviving captives were forced to drag corpses outside the walls, where they were piled into enormous heaps and later burned. The scale of the killing was so great that exact numbers disappeared into the language of awe and horror. For the conquerors, it was proof of total victory. For later generations, it became one of the darkest memories of the Crusade. 8 days after Jerusalem had been taken, the crusading leaders met to decide how the city and its surrounding lands were to be governed. The obvious solution was to choose a king, yet the honour was less attractive than it seemed. The city was sacred, but it was also exposed, poor, difficult to defend, and surrounded by enemies. Many of the great lords had already begun thinking of home. Their vow had been fulfilled. The hardest marches and sieges were behind them. To remain in Jerusalem as ruler meant not glory alone, but labour, danger, shortage, and constant war. One after another, leading princes declined the title. Some did so out of caution, some perhaps out of genuine reluctance, some because the burden was greater than the reward. In the end, attention settled on Godfrey of Bouillon. He had earned immense prestige in the campaign, especially through his role in the final assault on Jerusalem. And unlike some of the other princes, he had not been consumed by the most bitter factional quarrels. He agreed to take charge, but he would not call himself king in the city where Christ had suffered. Instead, he accepted a humbler title, presenting himself not as a crowned monarch, but as the guardian of the Holy Sepulchre. The gesture mattered. It allowed authority to be established without seeming to compete with the sacred character of the city. In practice, however, he had become the ruler of a new state. Once a secular head had been chosen, a spiritual one also had to be appointed. That contest was more contentious than it might appear. Several men had claims or ambitions, but the office ultimately went to Arnulf, a cleric attached to Robert of Normandy. He was a controversial figure. Some remembered him as cultivated and intellectually gifted, others as morally lax and deeply compromised. He had been among the loudest skeptics of the Holy Lance and had nearly paid for that skepticism with his life during the earlier disputes in the Crusader camp. Yet his influence had grown while that of the Provençal visionaries had weakened, and his prominence during the later stages of the campaign had made him difficult to ignore. His election as the first Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem was a sign that the balance of influence inside the crusading movement had shifted sharply away from the men who had once built morale through prophecy and miracle. Soon after the capture of the city, Tancred and Eustace moved north to secure Nablus. At Jerusalem itself, however, peace among the leaders remained fragile. A dispute broke out almost immediately between Godfrey and Raymond over control of the Tower of David. Raymond had refused to give it up, and when Godfrey eventually took it from the man to whom it had been entrusted, Raymond reacted in bitterness and threatened to leave for home at once. Before doing anything so final, he followed one of the strange ritual instructions associated with Peter Bartholomew and made a pilgrimage to the Jordan. There, in a scene that mixes piety with theatrical symbolism, his followers improvised a small wicker craft to carry him over the water, then stripped him of his worn garments and dressed him in new ones on the far side. Even those involved did not seem fully certain what the act was meant to accomplish. It was simply one more sign of how deeply prophetic gestures, symbolic rites, and half-understood revelations had entered the mental world of the Crusade. In August, urgent news arrived that a large Egyptian army was gathering at Ascalon. There was no time for further internal quarrels. Tancred and Eustace were recalled. Godfrey and Robert of Flanders marched out first from Jerusalem. Robert of Normandy and Raymond hesitated, unwilling to move on uncertain reports, but a sharp message from Godfrey made the choice clear. If they wanted a share in the battle, they had to come at once. They joined the march, while Peter the Hermit remained in Jerusalem to organize prayers and public acts of devotion on behalf of the army. On August 11th, the Crusader host advanced toward Ascalon. The Egyptians did not seem to expect any serious threat from an enemy they believed to be too weak to attack. Their camp was large, confident, and poorly prepared for sudden battle. Astrologers and diviners had reportedly advised delay, and that only deepened the sense of carelessness in the camp. The Crusaders moved forward in battle order. Godfrey held one wing, Raymond another, while the central divisions included the two Roberts and Tancred. Once the armies came into contact, the result was swift. There was little of the long uncertainty that marked Antioch or Dorileam. The Egyptian force broke rapidly. Some fled toward the sea, others tried to hide, others were cut down where they ran. The battle became less a contest than a rout. The day's greatest personal distinction seems to have fallen to Robert of Normandy, who seized the enemy standard after killing its bearer. The captured banner, with its costly shaft and ornament, was later dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre. The amount of booty taken after the battle was immense. Animals, grain, biscuit, flour, and supplies of every kind were carried back in such quantity that Jerusalem, so recently a place of shortage and suffering, suddenly saw abundance. Prices dropped sharply, and the camp that had known thirst and hunger now found itself temporarily well stocked. Even this victory did not end the rivalry between Godfrey and Raymond. The citizens of Ascalon had reportedly offered submission to Raymond, but the other leaders argued that such an important coastal fortress must belong to the central power if the new realm was to survive. The matter nearly led to open conflict. Later accounts claim that Raymond would rather see the town return to the Egyptians than yield it to Godfrey, though the story survives in too many forms to be accepted without caution. Whatever the precise truth, the dispute was serious enough that only outside mediation prevented the two leaders from coming to blows. After Ascalon, many of the great lords began preparing to leave the east. The holy city had been taken, a major field army had been defeated, and for many the expedition now seemed complete. The road home opened once more. Some returned through northern Syria, where the terror created by recent Crusader victories had persuaded several local garrisons to offer safe passage or even welcome. Raymond, unable to secure other ambitions, at least gained influence along the coast when one contested city was handed over to him rather than to Bohemond. These were small compensations for much larger disappointments. Godfrey, however, stayed and began the hard work of transforming conquest into rule. He campaigned against Arsuf, though without decisive success at first, and then returned to Jerusalem for the winter. Around this time, Baldwin and Bohemond arrived in the south, and the journey they made to the Holy City offers a vivid example of how punishing travel in the region could still be. Their following included not only knights and armed retainers, but also women, children, clergy and dependents, an entire moving community rather than a simple military column. Along the road, food was repeatedly denied them, and fodder for horses was scarce. They survived in part by chewing sugarcane from cultivated fields, which eased thirst and hunger only slightly. Cold rain tormented them for days at a time, and many among the weaker travellers died of exposure. Only in a few places did they find open markets. When they reached Jerusalem at last near the winter solstice, they visited the Holy Sepulchre and kept vigil at Bethlehem on Christmas Eve. Even then, months after the city's capture, the lingering stench of the dead still hung in the air. Early in the new year, the travellers set out north again, cutting palm branches by the Jordan like returning pilgrims of old. Around the same time, Bohemond was drawn into another campaign after the ruler of Melitene asked for aid against a Turkish rival. Always eager to expand his influence, he accepted. On the march, however, his force was caught in an ambush. The heat had led many of his men to march without armour, and the result was disastrous. Most of the Franks were cut down, and Bohemond himself was captured along with his cousin Richard. His imprisonment removed one of the most formidable Crusader leaders from the field at a critical moment. Godfrey, meanwhile, forced Arsuf to come to terms and secured promises of tribute from several coastal towns, including places still formerly under Muslim control. His growing authority was felt not only in the settled towns but even among tribal groups farther south and east, who preferred peace and trade to conflict with the new ruler of Jerusalem. Yet peace on land did not mean peace at sea. Saracen warships still moved actively through the eastern Mediterranean, and the struggle for supply and communication remained constant. One of Godfrey's most important practical concerns was Jaffa. The port was vital to the survival of the new kingdom. It was the main entry point for Western reinforcements, and one of the few places through which the Franks could reliably receive supplies, without depending entirely on local populations. Strengthening Jaffa, therefore, became a priority. He was called away from that task when Tancred needed support near the Sea of Galilee. But once that expedition ended, Godfrey returned toward the coast. It was on this journey that he fell gravely ill. Rumours quickly spread that he had been poisoned by fruit sent from Caesarea, though whether this was true or merely a familiar explanation for sudden illness is impossible to know. At Jaffa he met newly arrived Venetian leaders, but he was already too weak for prolonged discussion. That same night his condition worsened. Finding the bustle and heat of the port unbearable, he had himself carried back up to Jerusalem. There, on July 18th, 1100, only a year and 3 days after the fall of the city. He died and was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. His death was marked thereafter, together with the anniversary of Jerusalem's capture, and gifts were distributed in memory of his wishes. Among all the leaders of the First Crusade, Godfrey came more quickly than any other to embody its ideal image. He united religious seriousness with military energy in a way that later generations found irresistible. Stories began to gather around his name almost immediately. He was remembered as a man destined from youth for a sacred mission, a leader marked out by providence. In reality, he had not always stood above the other princes in prestige or power, and his election in Jerusalem owed much to the rivalries that divided the men of northern and southern France. Because he had remained outside some of the fiercest feuds, he became the acceptable choice when compromise was necessary. His personal piety was widely admired. He refused the royal crown because he would not wear gold where Christ had worn thorns. He was drawn to prayer even in moments of military triumph, and was known for the seriousness with which he treated religious observance. At the same time, he was no harmless saint. He could be stern, severe in discipline, and ruthless in war. Yet during his brief rule, he seems to have sought stability more than personal magnificence, and his death was mourned not only by Latin settlers, but by many of the different peoples living in and around Jerusalem. Very quickly his memory moved beyond history into legend. Songs were sung about him, stories attached his lineage to older heroic traditions. In later medieval literature, he stood beside the great figures of Christian romance, rivaling the fame of Arthur and Charlemagne. Tales were added to his life that belonged more to poetry than to fact. His ancestry became entangled with legendary noble lines, his family with older miracle stories, and his crusading deeds with the larger imagination of medieval Europe. In campfire songs, in epics, and in later retellings, he became more than a ruler. He became the heroic face of the First Crusade itself. Of the major crusading leaders, only Raymond, Bohemond, Tancred and Baldwin remained in the east after his death. The others had gone home, and many met unhappy ends. Robert of Normandy returned too late to secure the English crown after the death of his brother, and later spent the rest of his life in captivity after defeat in the west. Robert of Flanders also made it home, only to die years later after a fall from his horse. Hugh of Vermandois, sent east again after Antioch, died during a later and disastrous expedition. Stephen of Blois, driven back into crusading by the reproaches of his wife after his earlier shameful withdrawal, also returned east and was killed in battle. That later wave of crusading deserves notice because it revealed how powerfully the fall of Jerusalem had reignited enthusiasm in men who had ignored the first call. Victory had inspired those whom preaching had failed to move. Among the new arrivals was William of Aquitaine, a great lord whose motives seem to have mixed curiosity, ambition, and adventure more than deep religious discipline. One huge and disorderly group from Lombardy reached Constantinople and caused trouble almost as soon as it arrived. Their unruliness culminated in violence inside the imperial palace itself. They then crossed into Asia and joined up with other Western leaders. At that point, disagreement broke out over the route. Some wanted to follow the older crusading road through Anatolia toward Syria. Others were seized by grand and confused visions of marching eastward into distant lands to rescue prisoners or seize famous capitals they barely understood. Distrust of the Byzantine emperor added to the confusion, and some groups abandoned the land route entirely and sailed instead. Raymond joined one of the overland forces. At first, the march passed through fertile country, but beyond that lay dry and dangerous regions, where Turkish attacks began to wear the expedition down. Stragglers and the weak were picked off with arrows, rearguards were cut to pieces, panic spread. At a crucial moment, Raymond himself withdrew with his followers, leaving others to fend for themselves. Whether necessity drove him or fear, the result was the same. The expedition collapsed into confusion, and noblewomen, baggage, and camp followers fell into enemy hands as leaders fled. Another army under William of Nevers followed the same route and was reduced to a tiny remnant before reaching Antioch. Duke William of Aquitaine arrived later with another vast body of pilgrims, including other high nobles and, according to some accounts, immense numbers of non-combatants. This force fared no better. In Asia Minor, it suffered catastrophic losses. Thousands were killed or captured. Some wandered for days in the hills, barely escaping alive. Important nobles vanished or died, and William himself survived only by fleeing, with a single companion until help reached him. The fall of Jerusalem to the Crusaders and the creation of a kingdom bearing its name marked only the beginning of a much larger and more complex struggle. At the time of Godfrey's death, the territory under Frankish control remained limited, consisting mainly of Jerusalem itself and the fragile routes that connected it to Byzantine lands. Although leaders like Bohemond in Antioch and Baldwin in Adessa had already secured their own domains, the real expansion of Crusader power unfolded under the rulers who followed Godfrey. Even then, the history of Frankish rule in the region was never stable. While expansion continued in some areas, elsewhere their territories were already beginning to shrink under renewed Muslim resistance. The peak of their power came during the reign of Baldwin II, when their influence stretched across a vast area, reaching from the lands near Mardin in the north down to the borders of Egypt in the south. Yet this extent existed more in theory than in consistent reality. Geographically, the lands claimed by the Crusaders formed a narrow and vulnerable corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the Great Desert to the east. This region had natural defensive advantages but also significant weaknesses. Its length extended over 500 miles, while its width rarely exceeded 50 miles and was often much narrower. This made it difficult to defend as long frontiers were exposed to constant threats. Powerful Muslim cities such as Damascus, Hama, Hims and Aleppo remained outside Frankish control, creating a permanent danger. In the north, relative stability depended on maintaining Adessa and friendly relations with neighbouring Christian populations, while in later years, Egypt became an increasingly serious source of pressure. The landscape itself can be understood as a series of parallel zones running from north to south. Closest to the sea lay the coastal plains, a mix of sandy stretches and fertile lands. In some places these plains were wide and open, while in others they narrowed sharply along the Phoenician coast. Inland from the coast rose a range of hills and mountains, including the highlands where cities like Hebron and Jerusalem stood. Further north, the terrain became more dramatic, with the towering ridges of Lebanon and the mountains extending toward Antioch. Beyond these elevations lay a deep valley system formed by rivers such as the Orontes, the Litani, and the Jordan, creating a long natural trench that marked the eastern limits of Crusader expansion in most areas. Beyond this again stretched high plateaus and rugged lands bordering the desert, dotted with fertile regions that supported major Muslim cities. The Crusader presence in Syria was divided into 4 main political regions. The northernmost was the county of Adessa, a large but loosely defined territory extending across both sides of the Euphrates River. Its population was mostly Armenian and Syrian, with only a small number of Frankish settlers, concentrated in fortified towns. Edessa itself was both a stronghold and an important commercial centre, controlling key routes between Mesopotamia and Syria. To the west lay the Principality of Antioch, one of the earliest and most significant Crusader states. At its height, Antioch extended deep into Cilicia and included several important coastal ports. Over time, however, it lost territory due to pressure from both Byzantine forces and neighbouring powers, though it remained a central stronghold of Frankish influence. Further south stretched the county of Tripoli, a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea. It was a region of strategic importance, containing strong fortresses and thriving coastal cities. Tripoli itself became a centre of trade and craftsmanship, known especially for its silk production and intellectual life. Despite its independence in theory, it eventually fell under the authority of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as did Antioch and Adessa, creating a loose but interconnected system of Crusader states. The Kingdom of Jerusalem itself formed the southern core of Frankish rule. It extended along the coast from the region north of Beirut, down to the borders of Egypt, with its eastern frontier defined by the Jordan Valley and surrounding lands. Within this kingdom were several major lordships and numerous smaller territories, each governed by powerful nobles. Regions like Jaffa and Ascalon controlled vital coastal routes, while inland territories such as Kerak dominated trade paths linking Egypt and Syria. Galilee, centered around Tiberias, held important fortresses and fertile lands, while Sidon controlled key coastal and inland positions. Jerusalem stood at the heart of this system, both as a political center and as a sacred city of immense importance. Entering the city from the west, travelers would pass through gates near massive defensive towers and find themselves in streets lined with markets, religious buildings, and administrative centers. The city contained numerous churches and holy sites, many of which were rebuilt or expanded during the Crusader period. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in particular, became the focal point of Christian devotion, its structure enlarged and richly decorated. Other parts of the city, including former Islamic buildings, were adapted for new purposes, reflecting the layered and contested history of Jerusalem itself. The political system established by the Crusaders was deeply rooted in feudal traditions. Authority was distributed among powerful lords who held lands in exchange for military service and loyalty. This system was later described in a body of legal customs that attempted to define the rights and responsibilities of both nobles and common people. Although these laws were written down in a more organized form much later, they reflected a long tradition of governance shaped by both European practices and the realities of ruling in the East. Much of this legal tradition was lost during later conflicts, but its influence survived through oral transmission and later reconstruction. Some parts of the legal tradition associated with the Kingdom of Jerusalem can reasonably be traced back to Godfrey and the rulers who followed him in the earliest years. Among the most striking features were the demand for ongoing military service and the effort to prevent too much land from being gathered into a single lordship. These rules were designed for survival in a frontier state. Every holding was expected to remain capable of providing armed support, and no noble was supposed to become so powerful that the balance of the realm would be broken. In theory, this was a practical answer to the dangers of a recently conquered land surrounded by enemies. In practice, the system could not fully stop the pressures that gradually weakened the kingdom. Even so, the later history of the Latin East makes clear why such precautions were considered necessary from the start. The kingdom's decline was shaped in no small part by the failure to preserve that careful balance. At the centre of the political order stood the king, whose authority combined military leadership, judicial influence, and symbolic prestige. Around him developed a hierarchy of great officers whose roles were both ceremonial and deeply practical. The seneschal ranked among the highest of these. On formal occasions, he played a visible role in royal ritual, especially during the coronation and the great feasts of the year. But his responsibilities extended far beyond ceremony. He supervised royal revenues, oversaw officials responsible for local administration, inspected castles belonging to the crown, and held the power to appoint or dismiss those entrusted with their defence. When the king was absent, the seneschal could take charge of mobilization and military expeditions. Another figure of immense importance was the constable, whose place in the kingdom rested above all on war. He acted as the chief military officer, responsible for organizing the army and maintaining discipline in the field. Beneath him stood the marshal, who assisted with military administration and was tasked with hiring knights and mounted sergeants into royal service. The chamberlain managed key aspects of court ceremony and also oversaw the formal acts of homage through which vassals acknowledged the king's authority. Other officials, including the butler, the forester, and the chancellor, completed the structure of government. The chancellor in particular held a distinctive place, since he often remained in office even after receiving high ecclesiastical promotion. This pattern of government was not limited to Jerusalem alone. Comparable offices appeared in the great Frankish states beyond the kingdom itself. Antioch had its own constable and marshal, along with a senior official carrying the title of duke. In Adessa, too, similar officers can be seen beside the count, suggesting that the leading Crusader states all adopted related forms of administration. Even the lesser lordships within the kingdom had their own household officers and local authorities. In places such as Galilee, these men appeared as witnesses to charters and public acts, confirming how deeply feudal, custom-shaped political life. Great barons possessed seals of their own, symbols of their status and autonomy. The possession of such insignia mattered in a world where authority was expressed not only through force, but through written acts, witnessed agreements, and visible signs of lordship. Justice within this system was organized through a layered network of courts. At Jerusalem, there was a high court, presided over by the king whenever he was present, or by one of the leading officers in his absence. This body originally dealt above all with the affairs of the great nobles, but in time its influence widened. It became the place where the kingdom's political, legal, and administrative life was debated and shaped, serving in effect as both Supreme Court and Royal Council. Across the broader realm, major lords held similar authority within their own lands. Those who possessed full seigneurial rights could preside over courts, administer justice, and in some cases even exercise powers linked with minting and lordly sovereignty. Their courts handled criminal matters according to recognized custom, though they remained subordinate to the High Court in Jerusalem. Alongside this aristocratic system stood another body of justice more closely tied to urban life. In Jerusalem and in other towns where Frankish settlers formed sizable communities, there were courts for the burgesses. These handled civil disputes and were presided over by officials often known as viscounts. Acting as the representatives of the local lord, these men managed legal matters, supervised revenue, and exercised a wider administrative role within the town. Their office could become hereditary and in some cases was held by nobles rather than lesser urban officials. Supporting them were assistants responsible for policing and order. Separate institutions also emerged for commercial and maritime business. Merchants were not left to the ordinary courts alone. Trade disputes, harbour affairs, and questions involving local Syrian communities could be dealt with through more specialized jurisdictions. In these settings, local custom often remained highly influential, producing a legal environment that was flexible, layered, and in many respects more advanced than what could be found in much of contemporary Western Europe. The same general principles shaped the subordinate Crusader states. Antioch maintained its own high court and its own urban courts. Its legal customs were distinct, though closely related to those of Jerusalem, and they later influenced neighbouring Armenia as well. Tripoli seems to have followed similar patterns. Edessa, whose history under Frankish rule was relatively brief, probably never developed an equally elaborate legal structure, yet it almost certainly possessed institutions of the same general type. In the coastal cities, the great merchant colonies from Italy added another layer to this already complex order. Their communities enjoyed special privileges, maintained their own officials, and often governed many civil affairs internally, especially in matters of trade and property. Finance was another matter of constant urgency. The Latin states in Syria were born in war and remained under permanent military pressure, so money was never a secondary concern. Without a reliable flow of revenue, fortresses could not be supplied, mercenaries could not be retained, fleets could not be rewarded, and frontiers could not be held. A regular financial administration existed, managed through a central service, staffed by clerks, and overseen by officials of the crown. Customs duties formed one of the most important sources of income, especially in ports such as Arka, where trade passed through a tightly regulated system. Goods were inspected, tariffs were recorded, and the business of collection was carried out with a level of order that impressed even foreign visitors. The officials who managed this work often knew Arabic well and operated within a bureaucratic environment that reflected the commercial sophistication of the Eastern Mediterranean. Customs were only one part of the financial picture. Markets generated dues, caravans crossing strategic routes, paid tolls, and local industries could be subject to monopoly control. Activities such as dyeing, tanning, and brewing offered revenue to those who controlled them. Native Syrian communities paid regular taxes, while Muslims and Jews were subject to additional poll taxes. In times of emergency, extraordinary levies could also be imposed. During moments of grave danger, the crown demanded contributions not only from townsmen and peasants, but also from churches, monasteries, great lords, and their dependents. Such taxation was often carefully framed as exceptional, not something that should become normal practice. Officials were appointed to ensure that the money collected for defence would not be diverted to ordinary court expenses. Even so, the repeated need for such measures reveals how fragile the financial base of the kingdom remained. War was constant, and the cost of survival was always rising. The church was organised with equal complexity. From the earliest days of conquest, the Latin settlers began establishing bishops in the cities they controlled, shaping an ecclesiastical hierarchy that paralleled the older structure of Eastern Christianity. At the summit stood the patriarchs of Jerusalem and Antioch. Beneath them stretched a network of archbishoprics, bishoprics, abbeys, and priories of the Latin Rite. Yet the Latin clergy did not replace the older Eastern communities entirely. Armenian, Syrian, and Greek hierarchies continued to exist beside them, preserving older traditions within the same contested landscape. For a time, there were even signs of cautious cooperation among these different Christian groups, raising the possibility of closer unity. At the same time, the Latin clergy accumulated extensive wealth and influence. Through donations and patronage, they acquired lands not only in Syria but across Western Europe as well, making the Church one of the strongest corporate powers in the Crusader world. When Godfrey died, the transfer of power was far from automatic. The Patriarch at Jerusalem, a man of high ambition and sweeping ecclesiastical claims, hoped to shape the future of the city according to his own vision. But the lay leaders in Jerusalem refused to accept a political order dominated by clerical authority. They held the Tower of David, rejected outside manipulation, and called for Baldwin of Adessa, Godfrey's brother, to come south and take up the inheritance, Baldwin accepted the summons, entrusted Adessa to his relative Baldwin de Bourg, and set out for Jerusalem. His journey was not easy. Along the way, he faced resistance from the ruler of Damascus and had to fight through difficult mountain passes above the coast. Yet he reached Jerusalem and was received with magnificence, despite the visible hostility of the Patriarch. Once inside the city, he was recognized as king. The title was his, but the kingdom itself still had to be secured by force. From the beginning, Baldwin faced two problems that would define much of his reign. Too few men and too little money. When he left Adessa, his personal force was small. Even after reaching Jerusalem, the resources immediately available to him were limited. The Muslim powers surrounding the kingdom often fielded armies, far larger than anything the Franks could gather. Yet the Latin settlers endured and sometimes advanced by combining discipline, aggression, and outside support. Reinforcements from Western Europe rarely arrived in the form of permanent settlers in sufficient numbers, but fleets from Italy, England, and Scandinavia repeatedly transformed the military balance. Naval aid made it possible to besiege coastal cities, hold ports, and recover from reverses that might otherwise have destroyed the kingdom. Genoese ships played a key role in several major conquests. Pisans and Venetians did the same in different theatres. These allies did not fight for free. In exchange for their help, they received streets, quarters, commercial privileges, shares of booty, and valuable rights in the ports they helped secure. In Baldwin's early years, support also came from the household retainers attached to his own family and to the House of Godfrey. But retaining soldiers, rewarding service, and financing campaigns constantly strained the royal treasury. At times, Baldwin resorted to tribute from unconquered towns, forcing nearby cities to pay in exchange for temporary peace. At other moments, he accepted money instead of pressing a siege to its conclusion. Financial pressure also poisoned his relationship with the Patriarch. The struggle between crown and church was not merely a matter of personality, but of resources. Baldwin demanded military assistance and material support from the ecclesiastical establishment, while the Patriarch resisted. Their conflict escalated into open hostility. One patriarch fell from favour, another replaced him, and the balance between royal and clerical power remained uneasy. Baldwin's need for money also drove him toward harsher methods. Raids on caravans and attacks on rich convoys brought immediate profit. In one campaign east of the Jordan, an Egyptian caravan carrying valuable goods was seized, and its cargo taken to Jerusalem. On another occasion, wealth was acquired through means that badly stained the king's reputation. Promises of safe conduct were broken when treasure being moved for security became too tempting to ignore. Such actions reveal the brutal realities of frontier kingship in a land where survival often overruled principle. In another effort to strengthen his position, Baldwin married the wealthy widow of a Sicilian count. She arrived in splendid state, bringing treasure and soldiers with her, and for a time seemed to offer both financial relief and military reinforcement. Yet the marriage did not last, and after a few years she returned home. Baldwin's reign was marked by constant movement, ceaseless campaigning, and a restless search for opportunity. The southwestern frontier, especially the threat from Ascalon and Egypt, demanded repeated attention. Even before his coronation, he had been forced to move against this danger. In the early years of his reign, campaigns along the coast led to the capture of important cities, but every gain remained exposed to counterattack. At Jaffa and Ramleh, Baldwin faced some of the hardest fighting of his life. On one occasion, his outnumbered forces won an astonishing victory against a much larger Egyptian army. On another, he was disastrously defeated and barely escaped alive. After the battle, he wandered through the hills with only a tiny escort and reached safety under cover of darkness. Later, when Jaffa itself seemed close to falling, he risked everything by sailing boldly into the harbour past enemy ships, a dramatic act that helped save the city and restore morale until reinforcements arrived. The years after these crises saw a mixture of success and continuing danger. Acre was secured, Sidon was besieged, and conflict with Damascus continued through local lords and regional commanders. In Galilee, bold nobles carried out raids, ambushes, and border warfare in imitation of the larger struggle, often with fatal consequences. Some died in reckless attacks, others in captivity after refusing to bargain away Christian territory for their freedom. Meanwhile, Baldwin turned increasing attention to the lands east and south of the Dead Sea. There, he built strong fortresses to control caravan routes and project power toward Arabia. One campaign carried him as far as the waters of the Red Sea, a symbolic extension of Frankish ambition into regions few of his followers had ever imagined reaching. Yet the closing years of his life were overshadowed by signs of strain and disaster. Earthquakes shook the land. Locusts ruined crops and vineyards. Strange celestial events stirred fear and speculation. These were remembered as ominous signs, though their true meaning became clear only later, as deaths and misfortunes followed in rapid succession. In the final phase of his reign, Baldwin launched an attack into Egypt itself, hoping that a blow at the heart of that wealthy power might weaken resistance on the frontier. He reached the Nile region and plundered one city, but illness struck him before he could go further. Suffering from an old wound aggravated by the campaign, he had to be carried in a litter as the army retreated. He died on the road back toward Jerusalem. His body was preserved and borne home, and when the funeral procession approached the holy city, public celebration gave way to mourning. The grief was widespread, crossing divisions of language and faith. When Bohemond was captured by Ibn Danishmend, Tancred left Galilee and moved north in March 1101 to take control of Antioch in his kinsman's absence. He ruled with urgency and ambition, not simply to preserve Bohemond's position, but to strengthen his own standing before the prince could ever return. Under his direction, Laodicea was wrested from Byzantine control after a long siege, and Mamistra, Adana, and Tarsus were also recovered. These were not small gains. They showed that Antioch was no passive frontier state, but a power willing to expand whenever its rivals showed weakness. The Emperor Alexius could hardly have watched these events with patience. It is therefore entirely believable that he tried to secure Bohemond for himself, while the Norman prince was still in captivity. Bohemond learned of the plan and bought his freedom by offering more than the emperor's agents. From that moment, his hostility toward Byzantium hardened completely. The result was one of the strangest alignments of the age. Bohemond, once a crusading prince, now found himself moving in the same political direction as Ibn Danishmend, while Alexius and Kili Arslan stood on the other side of the struggle. Bohemond regained his liberty early in 1103, and soon afterward he was drawn into events around Adessa. Baldwin de Bourg had received that exposed county when Baldwin of Jerusalem rose to the throne, while Jocelyn de Courtenay took control of Baldwin's former lands west of the Euphrates. Adessa stood dangerously far forward, almost like an island in hostile territory, and its countryside suffered repeated devastation. Hoping to secure the frontier, Baldwin decided to occupy Harran and asked Bohemond, Tancred and Jocelyn to join the campaign. At that time, the Muslim powers of the region were deeply divided, and those rivalries gave the Franks room to act. The struggle for the Seljuk succession dragged on until early 1104, when Barkirok and Muhammad reached an uneasy settlement and divided what remained of their inheritance. In the confusion, local rulers focused on protecting themselves rather than organizing a united resistance. Mosul had passed from Kerbogar to Jekamish. Further north, Sokman ibn Artuk held authority at Hisin Kaifa. In the west, the same pattern of fragmentation continued. Ridwan ruled Aleppo, Tugtakin governed Damascus in the name of a younger heir, and Homs was under another local emir. Along the coast, the Egyptians were recovering positions they had once lost. With no commanding authority above them, the Franks had every opportunity to expand. And they understood very well how much advantage could be gained by balancing one rival against another. Yet on the question of Harran, two of those rivals set aside their dispute. Sokman and Jekamish combined to stop the Frankish advance, and outside the city they inflicted a crushing defeat. Baldwin and Jocelyn were captured. Bohemond and Tancred escaped to Adessa, where Tancred was chosen as lord by the Christians of the city. The defeat at Harran sent shockwaves through northern Syria. The Byzantines recovered Adana, Mamistra, and Tarsus, while Ridwan struck from the south, ravaging Arta and seizing Kafar Tab. Bohemond concluded that help must be sought in the west. Near the end of 1104 he left Syria for good. In France he married Constance, daughter of King Philip, and attracted new followers with promises of rich lands in the east. He later crossed into the Balkans and besieged Durazzo in 1107, but the campaign failed. By the following year he had returned to Italy, and in 1111 he died there, leaving behind two sons. The elder did not live long. The younger, also named Bohemond, would one day inherit Antioch. Tancred was left in an unenviable position. Antioch was discouraged, its treasury drained, and its people uncertain of the future. He responded with skill and severity, drawing money from the wealthy citizens while at the same time setting an example of personal discipline that restored some confidence among the population. His first major move was against Ridwan. He recovered Arta and the nearby strongholds, and for a time became the dominant power in northern Syria. Antioch, Adessa, and Tel Bashir all stood under his influence, and Aleppo itself seemed in danger of collapse. Only internal quarrels among the Franks and the later rise of powerful leaders in Mosul saved it from falling. Chance also worked in Tancred's favour. Several of his Muslim rivals disappeared in quick succession. Ibn Danishmend and Sokman both died, while the death of Barkiyarok left Muhammad as sole sultan. Jekamish had lost the vigour that once made him dangerous, and Ridwan attempted to exploit his weakness, though intrigue disrupted that effort. Meanwhile, the Sultan reassigned Mosul to one of his own officers, Jawali, who defeated Jekamish near the city. The citizens, still loyal to their old ruler, appealed to Kilij Arslan of Rum. Kilij Arslan came, relieved Mosul, and seemed poised to restore the situation, but in the summer of 1107 he was betrayed by allies and defeated by Jawali near the Khabur River. Jawali then held Mosul for a short time before being replaced by the Sultan's brother, Maudud, who soon rose as one of the most serious threats the Franks had yet faced. As Maudud advanced, Jawali fled to Ilghazi of Mardin, brother of Sokman, but found little support there and turned instead toward the Franks. He possessed a valuable bargaining tool. Baldwin of Adessa, who had become his prisoner after Jekamish's fall. A deal was arranged. Jocelyn, who had already been released, returned as a hostage for Baldwin. Tancred, however, refused to give Adessa back to its old lord, and Jawali, eager to strike at him, also released Jocelyn. This turned the conflict into a tangled struggle of shifting loyalties. Tancred called upon Ridwan of Aleppo for help, and near Tel Bashir, Muslim fought Muslim and Frank fought Frank in the same field. Tancred emerged victorious. Jawali fled eastward and eventually begged the Sultan for mercy. By then, Maudud had already secured Mosul, and Jawali no longer mattered. Baldwin returned to Adessa, but peace did not last. Early in 1110, Maudud appeared before the city with a massive army and pressed the siege for more than 3 months. Appeals for help went south to King Baldwin of Jerusalem, who delayed only long enough to finish taking Beirut. Once that city fell, he gathered his forces and marched north with a large army. Bertram of Tripoli came with him, as did the Armenian prince Kogh Vasil and Tancred, who in the face of a common danger put aside his jealousy. Their approach forced Maudud to withdraw toward Harran. Edessa was reinforced, but the retreat of the allied army soon led to disaster. At the Euphrates, only 2 boats could be found. Thousands of unarmed Armenians were left stranded on the far bank, when Turkish forces suddenly appeared. What followed was not truly a battle, but a slaughter. The king's troops could only watch from the opposite side as the fugitives were cut down and the river filled with blood. While Tancred had been away, Ridwan broke the truce. On returning, Tancred moved quickly and compelled him to buy peace with a large payment. The following year he invaded again and reduced Aleppo to fear and desperation. The city's distress echoed far beyond Syria. Reports reached Baghdad where anger erupted among the population. Men from Aleppo burst into the great mosque and tore at its fittings in protest, while others accused the rulers of failing in their duty to defend Islam. According to one account, even a message from Constantinople urged action against the Franks, and the outrage of the crowd only deepened the pressure on the Sultan. That wave of anger helped produce a major campaign in 1111 under Maudud, who besieged Tel Bashir. Yet division and uncertainty weakened the effort, and even Ridwan, after asking for help, refused Maudud entry into Aleppo. Tancred continued to profit from the confusion and kept pressing against Aleppo's defences. Then, late in 1112, while engaged in conflict with the Armenian prince Kogh Vasil, Tancred died. By hereditary right, Antioch should have passed to young Bohemond, still only a child, but the circumstances were too dangerous for such a succession to function. Power instead went with little resistance to Roger, son of Richard, Tancred's nephew, through his sister. Maudud remained active and in 1113 marched south with a great army, laying siege to Tiberias in Galilee. Baldwin of Jerusalem called Roger to join him and advanced from Acre. The Turks lured the king into danger, and one tradition even claimed that Baldwin was briefly captured, only to escape because his captor was distracted by plunder. The royal standard and tent were lost, and Baldwin withdrew with what remained of his force to a nearby hill. There he held out for nearly 4 weeks until reinforcements from Antioch arrived. During that time, Turkish cavalry ranged freely across the countryside between Jerusalem and Acre. At last, when supplies ran low, Maudud withdrew to Damascus, intending to resume the war later. He never got the chance. Soon after entering the mosque there, he was attacked by an assassin and mortally wounded. Suspicion quickly fell on Tughtekin, and outrage spread widely. Even Christian observers regarded Maudud as a formidable and intelligent enemy, whose death came in a manner unworthy of his power. Not long afterward, Ridwan of Aleppo also died. Real authority in the city passed into the hands of the eunuch Lulu, who first governed through one child ruler and then another, after murdering the first. Aleppo sank into deep instability, and no neighbouring Muslim prince showed much interest in saving it. In time, the Sultan sent a new army under al-Bursuki, accompanied by Zangi, who was still far from the fame he would later achieve. Antioch, meanwhile, passed through a period of fear and religious fervour. A series of severe earthquakes shook the Levant and stirred the conscience of the population. Processions filled the streets, People went barefoot from church to church, and public repentance became a visible part of city life. Roger also secured alliances with discontented Muslim rulers, including Tugtakin and Ilghazi, each anxious about his own standing. Roger took position near Apamea and asked Jerusalem and Tripoli for aid. When Bursuk advanced in 1115, he allowed the moment to slip away, and the arrival of Baldwin and the Count of Tripoli forced him to retreat without battle. But once the king returned south, he came back. Roger reacted with speed, marching toward Rugia with his own household troops. There, he received word that the enemy was still setting up camp in the valley below. He attacked at once. The Turks had sent their baggage ahead and were not prepared for battle. Their detachments were struck one by one before they could form up, and Bursuk fled. Roger returned to Antioch in triumph, bringing immense booty. The city celebrated him with extraordinary enthusiasm, and his victory secured Frankish dominance in northern Syria for the time being. Aleppo, already weakened by its own internal disorder, now seemed more vulnerable than ever. Even so, the Franks did not seize the city. They may have judged that it was more useful as a divided and frightened rival than as a difficult conquest to administer. That calculation would soon be tested. In 1119, Ilghazi returned to the field and moved with alarming speed, taking one fortress after another. Roger ignored cautious advice urging him to wait for Baldwin of Jerusalem, and marched out to meet the threat at a place later remembered with horror as the Field of Blood. The ground was poor, supplies were scarce, and camp followers carried news of the army's weakness to the enemy. A minor reverse near a nearby fortress further encouraged the Muslim advance. Roger sent one detachment forward and posted others to maintain watch, but the danger was already too close. On the morning of battle, the army confessed its sins, and Roger distributed his gold to the poor before putting on his armour. Scouts soon arrived with urgent news that the enemy were descending in force. The Christian line had barely formed when Muslim standards began to appear among the olive-covered slopes. Roger urged his men not to be frightened by numbers, and reminded them that they now fought not for earthly reward, but for survival and faith. In some parts of the field, the Franks fought well and even gained ground, but they were too heavily outnumbered. Then the Turcopoles broke in panic, and fear spread through the rest of the army. To make matters worse, a fierce wind drove dust into the faces of the Christians and blinded them. Roger fought on with a handful of followers until he was struck down and killed on June 27th, 1119. That disaster could easily have ended Antioch. Had Ilghazi moved immediately on the city, it might have fallen. Instead, he delayed, and that hesitation gave the Patriarch time to steady the population and organize resistance until Baldwin of Jerusalem arrived. The king marched north and eventually met the enemy near Danith. His caution prevented a night attack from succeeding. In the battle that followed, the fighting was hard and uncertain. The Count of Tripoli, holding one wing, was driven back into the king's line. The Archbishop of Caesarea, carrying the Holy Cross, was wounded by an arrow, and the near-bloodless wound was taken as a sign of divine favour. The relic was raised toward the enemy. The troops rallied, and on August 14th, Baldwin won the field. Roger's death marked the end of one phase in the history of Antioch. From that point onward, the principality's fate became more tightly linked to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The years that followed would no longer be shaped by the bold and independent rule of Tancred and Roger, but by a wider struggle in which Antioch could not stand alone. The story of Tripoli during these same years followed a similar pattern, though with its own rivals and pressures. There too, the Franks advanced amid Muslim division, but they faced competition from the Egyptian rulers, whose officials recovered much of the Syrian coast during the years of confusion. Cities such as Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Tripoli came under their influence, and the future county of Tripoli had to be carved from territory defended not only by local emirs but also by Egyptian power. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, unable to hold Laodicea against Bohemond's ambitions, had earlier gone to Constantinople to seek support from Alexius, and later joined the crusading movement of 1101. Though he avoided some of the worst disasters that overtook others, he eventually fell into Tancred's hands and had to buy his freedom by promising not to make conquests north of Acre. Once Bohemond returned, Raymond considered himself released from that restriction and renewed the siege of Tripoli. The city's ruler, Fakhr al-Mulk, called for aid from Damascus and Homs. Yet Raymond, though commanding only a small force, managed to drive both relieving armies away and tighten the blockade. Since the city could not be stormed directly, he established himself on Mount Pilgrim and continued the siege there until his death in February 1105. Raymond's reputation stood apart from many of the other early crusading leaders. He was remembered as a man of unusual persistence and seriousness, one who stayed committed to his path until death, rather than seeking comfort elsewhere. After he died, the siege was carried on by his nephew, William Jordan. Raymond had also left behind a young son, Alfonso, who was sent to France. His older son, Bertram, eventually gave up family claims in the west and sailed east to take possession of what he believed belonged to him. On reaching the Levant, Bertram demanded his father's inheritance from William Jordan. William refused and sought Tancred's support, while Bertram established a separate camp and resumed the siege in his own name. The danger of civil conflict among the Franks alarmed Baldwin of Jerusalem, who hurried north and imposed a settlement. William Jordan was to keep Arka and the lands he already held. Bertram would receive the rest of Raymond's inheritance if he could secure it. Tancred, who had grievances of his own, was satisfied with territorial compensation elsewhere. With the Christian leaders temporarily reconciled, the siege of Tripoli was renewed in earnest in 1109. Famine was already weakening the city, and the expected Egyptian relief never arrived because contrary winds kept the fleet away. In the end, the defenders accepted Baldwin's offer that their lives would be spared, but the Genoese, eager for loot and vengeance, forced their way in and slaughtered many within the city. Before Tripoli's final fall, William Jordan died after being struck by an arrow under suspicious circumstances, while riding at night. With his rival gone, Bertram secured his position and became the king's vassal. In this way, the county of Tripoli was drawn formally into the political order of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. When Baldwin I died, the kingdom faced an immediate question of succession. A number of leading nobles wanted the crown to go to Eustace, the dead king's brother who still remained in the west. Others argued that the realm could not afford delay. Among the strongest voices in favour of immediate action was Jocelyn de Courtenay, Lord of Tiberias, who supported Baldwin of Adessa. His opinion carried unusual force because he was no natural ally of Baldwin and had often stood against him. Jocelyn insisted that a kingdom under constant military pressure needed a ruler already present in the east, not a distant claimant who might hesitate to abandon the comfort and security of his lands in Europe. Once the patriarch endorsed the same course, the nobles accepted it, and Baldwin of Adessa was chosen king. A few men still tried to reach Eustace and offer him the throne, but he rejected the proposal with dignity, refusing to let his name become the cause of division in a kingdom so dangerously placed. The new ruler, Baldwin II, came from the house of Rethel near Reims. He had travelled east with the First Crusade and had long ago carved out his place in the politics and warfare of the frontier. In his earlier years, he had been deeply involved in the struggle for Adessa, and after many trials, he eventually inherited that exposed county when his cousin, rose to the throne of Jerusalem. By the time he became king, he was already a veteran of nearly every major danger that had shaped the Latin East. He was tall, broad in bearing, and still impressive in old age. His fair hair had faded toward white, his beard had grown long though thin, and his face, weathered by years of campaigning, still carried the energy of a fighting man. He was an experienced rider, a disciplined commander, and unlike some bolder but less cautious princes, he understood the value of preparation, timing, and restraint. He also had a reputation for deep personal piety. Contemporaries described him as a ruler whose devotion was not merely public display, but part of his daily life. The first years of his reign were dominated by the defense of the northern frontier, especially Antioch and Adessa. His earlier success against Ilghazi had already restored some confidence, but the threat had by no means disappeared. In the summer of 1120, Ilghazi returned with a large force of Turkoman fighters, men accustomed to rapid warfare, long marches, and irregular plundering raids. They carried little with them except what they needed to survive and what they hoped to seize. Their loyalty was shallow, fixed more on profit than on discipline, and when Ilghazi tried to control their conduct too strictly, many of them drifted away. Weakening under desertion, he had little choice but to arrange a truce. That agreement did not last. The unstable politics of the region, combined with the rash behaviour of Jocelyn, now Count of Adessa, soon reopened the conflict. The situation became even more tangled when Suleiman, Ilghazi's son and ruler in Aleppo, rose in defiance against his own father and sought Baldwin's help. The king named his price clearly: the return of Atharib. Suleiman refused. Baldwin argued that the town was too exposed to remain a useful Muslim possession, surrounded as it was by Christian strongholds. But argument achieved nothing. These disputes eventually forced Ilghazi to settle matters in a different way. To secure peace, he surrendered both Zardana and Atharib around the summer of 1121. Even then, the agreement proved worthless. The following year, despite the truce, Ilghazi crossed the Euphrates again with his powerful nephew Balak and laid siege to Zardana. Baldwin at first refused to believe that Ilghazi would break faith so openly. He had honoured the agreement on his own side and had even protected Ilghazi's interests during his absence. The king's trust was sincere, perhaps too sincere for the politics of the frontier. Once the truth became clear, he summoned Jocelyn and moved north to relieve the town. But events shifted before a decisive confrontation could take place. Illness forced Ilghazi to abandon the siege, and not long afterward he died on the road back toward Mardin. His death removed one danger, but another had already risen in its place. Balak soon struck a heavy blow. He moved against Adessa, and Jocelyn marched out to save it. On paper, the odds should have favoured the Christians, since Balak could gather only a limited, mounted force at short notice. Yet the ground itself turned against the Franks. Recent rain had softened the soil, and the heavy cavalry that usually gave them strength, instead, became trapped and slow. Turkish archers exploited that weakness with deadly precision. Jocelyn and his nephew Walaran were captured after the defeat. When they refused to buy freedom by surrendering Adessa, they were imprisoned in the fortress of Kartpert in September 1122. This success drew Baldwin himself toward the Euphrates. In the spring of 1123, he attempted to move in relief of another threatened point, but during a night march his forces stumbled into an ambush. The result was disastrous. Many of the Franks were cut down, and Baldwin also fell into enemy hands. Like Jocelyn, he was taken to Kartpert. Balak's prestige rose sharply. He forced his way into Aleppo and soon turned his attention toward other Christian positions. For a moment it seemed that the northern balance of power might collapse entirely. Then came one of the boldest rescue attempts of the age. Jocelyn had won real loyalty among many of his Armenian subjects, and a group of them devised a desperate plan to free him and the king. About 50 men disguised themselves as merchants and approached Cartpert, carrying goods as if for trade. They entered the town gradually, avoiding suspicion, and made their way toward the citadel. There, they found one of the gate wardens carelessly distracted. In an instant, the disguises were thrown aside, knives flashed, and the guards were overwhelmed before alarm could spread too far. Baldwin and the other prisoners were released, and a Christian banner was raised above the fortress. Yet success created a new dilemma. Escape through enemy territory was too dangerous for the whole group, and the rescued men decided to hold the citadel until help arrived from Antioch or Jerusalem. Jocelyn volunteered to slip out and carry the news. Under cover of darkness, accompanied by a few servants, he passed through the surrounding enemy lines and later sent back his ring as proof that he had escaped. After wandering for hours, hungry and exhausted, the small band reached the Euphrates. Jocelyn could not swim, so his companions improvised a raft from inflated skins and brought him across. From there, the escape took on almost the quality of legend. A peasant recognized his lord despite Jocelyn's attempts at concealment, offered help without asking payment, hid him, and then disguised him in women's clothing for the next stage of the journey. Mounted awkwardly on a donkey and carrying a child to complete the disguise, Jocelyn was led safely toward Tel Bashir. The danger was real at every step, but the ruse succeeded, and he finally made his way on toward Jerusalem and Antioch to seek aid. While Jocelyn travelled south, Balak rushed back to Cartpert. He attacked with determination, undermining the rock beneath the citadel and forcing an entry. The defenders among the poorer Franks and Armenians were massacred. Baldwin and Walaran were carried away again, this time to Haran. Jocelyn, learning that the fortress had fallen before he could bring help, had no choice but to redirect his efforts. Unable to save the captives immediately, he turned instead against Aleppo and threatened Muslim positions in the surrounding region. His operations there were effective enough to pull Balak back toward the Orontes. In the spring of 1124, Balak advanced from Aleppo toward Manbij. Jocelyn marched out with a relatively small force to oppose him. At first, the fighting seemed to favour the Christians, but the balance shifted and Jocelyn was eventually forced to withdraw. Even so, Balak did not live to enjoy the advantage for long. While pressing the siege of Manbij, he was mortally wounded. His death transformed the political situation again. Control in Aleppo passed to Hussam al-Din, son of Ilghazi, and from him Baldwin negotiated his release. The price was heavy. Several towns had to be surrendered, along with a large ransom in money, and Baldwin was finally freed at the end of August 1124. Once released, Baldwin did not behave like a broken captive returning gratefully from imprisonment. He moved quickly back into the struggle and directed his attention once more toward Aleppo. The city's inhabitants, alarmed by renewed Frankish pressure, appealed to al-Basuki of Mosul. He intervened and pushed the Christians back early in 1125, securing Aleppo for himself. Yet Baldwin answered in the field not long afterward and defeated him in turn. These campaigns confirmed what had become increasingly obvious. No single ruler could effectively manage both Jerusalem and Antioch over the long term. The northern principality needed a resident prince. For that reason, Baldwin summoned the young Bohemond from Italy. He arrived in Antioch in the autumn of 1126, and in Baldwin's presence, the nobles of the principality swore loyalty to him. To strengthen the arrangement, the king gave Bohemond his daughter Alice in marriage. The restoration of a prince from the old Antiochene line seemed at first a sound solution, but the promise did not last. Bohemond soon became entangled in conflict with Jocelyn, and the disagreement grew serious enough that Baldwin had to intervene and reconcile them. Not many years later, Bohemond met an early death in Cilicia, cut down in battle while still young. He had shown courage and potential, but little time to fulfill it. After his death, Antioch passed not to an adult heir, but to his infant daughter Constance, opening yet another uncertain chapter in the history of the North. Beyond these northern campaigns, Baldwin's reign was also shaped by repeated warfare closer to Jerusalem itself. Egypt remained a constant enemy through the stronghold of Ascalon, and Tutankhamun of Damascus was always ready to coordinate pressure from the east when circumstances allowed. Baldwin answered with repeated expeditions across the Jordan. In one notable campaign early in 1126, he struck Tutankhamun near Marj al-Safar and inflicted a serious defeat. These operations did not destroy Damascus or Ascalon, but they kept both powers from acting too freely and reminded every neighbouring ruler that Jerusalem was still capable of forceful retaliation. Yet the greatest event of Baldwin's reign came not in an open field battle, but in the taking of Tyre. At the time, the city was held for the Egyptian regime, and its governor remained formally loyal to the Vizier al-Afdal. Pressed hard by Frankish pressure and receiving little effective help from Egypt, the men of Tyre turned to Tutankhamun of Damascus and offered to accept his protection if he would defend them. He agreed to support them and sent troops under an officer named Masud, but he avoided openly claiming the city for himself. Instead, he presented his intervention as temporary aid. This careful balance collapsed after al-Afdal was murdered. The Egyptian admiral, acting treacherously, seized Masud and sent him away to Egypt. That act alienated Tugtakin and created the opening the Franks had been waiting for. During Baldwin's captivity, the kingdom had named Eustace Grenier, Lord of Caesarea and Sidon, as regent. At almost the same time, a powerful Venetian fleet under Doge Domenico Michiel reached the coast and anchored at Jaffa. The arrival of this fleet changed everything. The Doge travelled to Jerusalem at Christmas, where an agreement was reached with the leading lords of the kingdom to launch a joint attack on one of the remaining coastal strongholds. Debate followed over which target to choose. Some wanted Ascalon, others preferred Tyre. In the end, the decision was placed in the hands of chance through a solemn religious ceremony, and the choice fell on Tyre. The siege began at once under the combined leadership of the regent and the Venetian doge. The city was defended stubbornly, and every possible effort was made to save it. Tugtakin came from Damascus. A fleet was sent from Egypt. Forces from Ascalon tried to distract the Franks by raiding deep toward Jerusalem itself. None of it was enough. The raiders from Ascalon were driven back. The Venetians defeated the Egyptian fleet at sea. Forces under William of Bures and Pons of Tripoli prevented Tutakin from changing the course of the siege. The entire kingdom seems to have committed itself to this effort. When the attack slowed because siege machinery was insufficient, an Armenian engineer of exceptional skill was brought from Antioch to solve the problem. Hunger finally did what arms alone had not yet achieved. After prolonged suffering and near starvation, Tyre surrendered in July 1124. Its fall was one of the greatest Frankish gains since the First Crusade. With Tyre in Christian hands, the southern coast of the kingdom became far more secure, and the political map of the region shifted decisively. By the end of his life, Baldwin II was an old man and had no son to inherit the throne. He had to solve the question of succession in a different way. Rather than choose a husband for his eldest daughter, Melisande, from among his own nobles, he looked westward for a prince of sufficient stature. His final choice was Fulk, Count of Anjou, who arrived at Acre in the spring of 1129. The marriage took place soon afterward, and Tyre and Acre formed part of Melisandre's marriage portion. Baldwin had thus prepared the future of the crown as carefully as circumstances allowed. Only 2 years later, his strength finally failed. Feeling death approach, and concerned as much for his soul as for his kingdom, he left the splendour of the royal palace and withdrew to lodgings near the Holy Sepulchre. There, setting aside royal display, he took on the clothing of a monk and died on August 13th, 1131. He was buried near the earlier kings of Jerusalem, close to the most sacred ground of the city he had ruled. With Baldwin's death, an era truly ended. He was the last great survivor in Palestine of the generation that had built the first Frankish states in the east. His reign had not been free of disaster. His captivity alone might have broken a weaker kingdom, yet the years of his rule were, on the whole, years of resilience, recovery, and expansion. Jerusalem extended its influence into Antioch, held its own against Damascus and Egypt, and captured Tyre, one of the most valuable prizes on the coast. The age of rapid conquest was now drawing to a close. Ahead lay a different kind of history, one no longer defined by sudden crusading triumph, but by a harder and less certain struggle in which gains and losses would alternate until the balance finally turned with the rise of Saladin.